Welcome back, dear listener. Settle in, let the lights go low, and let your breathing slow, and let the whole long weight of the day sink down out of your shoulders and away into the dark. Because tonight we are going to travel a very long way back across nearly 2,000 years to a city of white marble and warm dust and endless murmuring crowds. A city that believed, with all of its enormous and untroubled heart, that it would stand forever. And in that city, beneath the temples and the columns and the soft gold evening light, we are going to meet a young man whose name has come down to us across all the centuries wrapped in horror. A name spoken even now as a kind of warning, the name of a monster. But the truth of him, dear listener, as the truth of almost every one of us tends quietly to be, is stranger and slower and sadder and far more human than the legend that grew up afterward over his bones. So let the legend go, just for tonight. Let it drift away like smoke, and come with me instead, slowly, the way you might walk through a dim and beautiful and half-forgotten room, touching nothing, only looking, and we will see together what was really there. Imagine, if you will, that you are standing at the edge of the great Forum of Rome on a warm evening in the spring of the year that we have learnt to call 37, in the years after the birth of Christ. Though no one moving past you in the gathering dusk would measure the year in that way, or would have any reason yet to think that the world had quietly turned a corner. The sun is going down behind the temples, low and golden, and the long rows of marble columns are catching the last of the light and turning the warm soft colour of honey, and the shadows are growing long and cool and blue between them, pooling in the colonnades, gathering under the arches, spreading slowly across the worn stones of the open square where the whole life of the city has flowed back and forth for hundreds of years. And everywhere around you there is the low and constant and soothing sound of a great city letting go of the day. The rattle of the last cartwheels over the paving stones, the calling of voices from the high windows of the apartment blocks, the bark of a dog far off down some narrow shadowed street. The slow clatter of wooden shutters being drawn closed, one after another, against the coming night. The air smells of wood smoke, and of baking bread, and of the dust that the day has raised, and the cool of the evening is now laying gently back down, and underneath it all, faint and green, the smell of the river, and somewhere the wilting sweetness of flowers left as an offering on the steps of a little shrine, and the whole vast crowd of the city, hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of living souls, the slaves and the senators, the soldiers and the shopkeepers, the mothers and the children and the old men dozing in the last of the warmth, all of them are moving through the soft, descending dark, with a feeling in the air that you could almost reach out and touch, a feeling of held breath, of waiting, of something enormous that has just happened, or is just about to, that the whole city has been waiting for a very long time. For an old man has been dying, far away across the water, on a beautiful island, and now, at last, the old man is dead. His name was Tiberius, and he had ruled the entire Roman world for 22 long and heavy years, and by the slow bitter end of them, almost no one loved him any more. He had grown old, and suspicious, and weary, and afraid, and many years before he had gone away from Rome altogether, out to a high cliffside palace on the island of Capri, far out in the bright blue sea off the southern coast, and from that lonely and beautiful and isolated place he had ruled the world by letter, sending his commands across the water to the city he no longer wished to see. And the city had learnt, slowly and painfully, to dread the letters that came, for a letter from the island might raise a man up, or it might quietly destroy him, and there was no telling in advance which it would be. But now the old man was gone. Now the letters would stop, and into his empty place there was coming to Rome a young man of just 24 years, beautiful and beloved, the last bright surviving hope of a family that the people had adored beyond all reason. And so the city, in the warm and fragrant spring dark, was gathering itself to pour out into the streets and welcome that young man with a joy it had not felt in a whole generation. They did not know, those waiting hopeful crowds, what he would one day become. How could they possibly have known? He did not yet know it himself. On that one spring evening he was simply the most beloved young man in all the world, and the entire future lay open and shining and golden before him, and not a single soul in all that vast and joyful multitude could have begun to imagine the long, strange, creeping darkness that was waiting, patient and silent, at the far end of it. But to understand him, dear listener, to truly understand him, and not merely to shudder at him the way the centuries have taught us to, we must go back further still, back behind the marble and the cheering crowds, to a cold green country at the very edge of the known world, where the gentle story of the little boots first begins. For he was not born into quiet or obscurity. He was born in the year we call 12, into the very heart and centre of the most famous family that the world when held, the family of the Caesars, the rulers of Rome, and his father was a man named Germanicus. And I would ask you to hold that one name gently in your mind for a moment, dear listener, to cradle it carefully, because everything that follows, every turn and every shadow of this whole long story, hangs and depends upon it. For Germanicus was, by every single account that has drifted down to us through the long centuries, very nearly the most beloved man of his entire age. He was handsome, and he was brave, and he was generous, and he was gentle, a brilliant and victorious young general who wore his glory lightly and modestly, who was kind and easy with the common soldiers who served beneath him, and the whole Roman people loved him the way that a people will, once or twice in a long age, fix all of its love and all of its hope upon one single shining figure, completely and helplessly, and without any reason at all, pouring into that one person everything they wish a leader could be. And this beloved and golden man was the father of our small boy, and he carried that boy, when the child was still very small, away to the far cold northern edge of the empire, to the wild and misty banks of the great river Rhine, where the iron legions of Rome stood watch in their wooden forts and their palisaded camps against the dark and trackless forests of Germania, and against the fierce free tribes who lived and hunted within them. And it was there, dear listener, out among the leather tents and the smoking campfires and the rough, weathered, kind-hearted soldiers of the Rhine frontier, that the small boy was given the name that we still know him by today, for his mother, a proud and fierce and formidable woman named Agrippina, dressed him half as a charm and half as a delight, as a tiny living mascot of the legions, in a perfect miniature soldier's uniform made specially to fit his small body, with a little soldier's cloak across his small shoulders, and a little sword at his side, and upon his small feet a little pair of the heavy iron-studded marching boots that every common legionary wore on the long roads of the empire, the boots that the soldiers called, in their rough camp Latin, Caligula, and the hard, homesick, war-weary men of the legions, far from their homes and their own families, in that cold and dripping country, would look up from their work and their fires, and see this small and solemn child marching gravely about the camp, in his miniature boots, playing at being one of them, and they were charmed, and they were softened, and something in them that the long war had hardened was for a moment made gentle again, and they took the boy entirely to their hearts, and they gave him an affectionate soldier's nickname, a tiny private joke passed from mouth to mouth and fire to fire all down the lines of the camp. They called him Caligula. It means, more or less, in their plain soldier's speech, Little Boots. Little Boots, the small grave son of their beloved Germanicus, the mascot of the army, the child that the whole frontier adored. He would come to hate that name, dear listener, when he was grown. He would never as a man permit anyone to speak it to his face. And yet it clung to him across all the long centuries, the way that the smallest and earliest things from our childhoods so often and so stubbornly do. And it is the name by which we know him still, 2,000 years later, you and I, lying here together in the quiet dark. Little Boots. So hold him there in your mind for a moment. In those first few years, the most fortunate child that one could possibly imagine. The adored son of the most beloved man in all the world, the pet and the darling of the Iron Legions, a small boy at the very centre of a great and golden and powerful family, with the entire vast and humming machinery of Roman dominion arranged all around him like a warm and shining and unshakable house, and a father who loved him, and a future that could not possibly, by any reckoning, have looked any brighter than it did. If the story had only stayed there, dear listener, it would be a gentle and a happy story, and we could let it carry us softly down into sleep. But the story did not stay there. The story almost never does, for when the boy was just 7 years old, his father, the beloved Germanicus, was sent away eastward on the great business of the empire, to the rich and ancient sun-warmed provinces of Syria, and there, very far from home, in what should have been only the early autumn of his life, the beloved general fell suddenly and strangely ill, and the illness was a slow one, and a creeping one, and it would not lift, and as he lay there day after day growing weaker, the beloved young man became convinced, and made those gathered grieving around him convinced as well, that he was not dying by any natural cause at all, but that he was being quietly and deliberately poisoned by some enemy moving in the shadows of the court. And whether there was any truth in that, dear listener, whether there was indeed poison in it, or only ordinary sickness and fever and the terror that fever brings, no living person has ever been able to say with certainty, and no one ever will. But the beloved Germanicus died there, in the warm distant east, far from the countless people who had adored him, and when the news of it at last came home across the sea to Rome, the grief that swept the city was like nothing it had ever known before or would easily know again. The shops closed their shutters, the temples stood empty, the markets fell silent, people wept openly in the streets, as though the very sun had gone dark in the sky. And the small boy who had once marched so gravely about the frontier camp in his little iron boots was, at 7 years old, suddenly and finally and forever fatherless, and the warm and shining house that he had been born into so safely began, very quietly and without anyone yet quite understanding it, to come apart at its foundations. For what followed, dear listener, across all the long years after the beloved Germanicus died, was a slow and grinding nightmare, and the growing boy lived through every single hour of it with his eyes open. The old Emperor Tiberius, suspicious and aging and lonely upon his throne, came over those years to see the family of the dead and beloved Germanicus not as beloved kin to be cherished and protected, but as dangerous rivals to be watched and feared, and at last removed, a bright and popular and dangerous bloodline that the fickle people loved far too much for an aging ruler's comfort. And so, one by one, across the long grim seasons of the boy's childhood and his adolescence, that family was taken apart. His proud and fierce mother, Agrippina, the very woman who had once dressed him in the little boots and laughed to see him march, was accused and disgraced and torn from him and sent away into bitter exile upon a barren rock of an island, where in the fullness of time alone she would die. His elder brothers, fine and promising young men, with their whole bright lives still before them, were accused in their turn, and seized and shut away, and they too, one after the other, came to dark and lonely ends in the silence of their confinement. And the boy watched it all happen. He watched his mother led away. He watched his brothers fall and vanish. He watched the warm house of his early childhood empty itself out, room by silent room, person by beloved person, until almost no one at all was left standing in it. And he came to understand, with the swift and terrible and unchildlike clarity of a frightened and intelligent child, that he himself was surrounded, that he himself was watched, and that the very smallest wrong word, the very smallest flicker of grief or of anger, crossing his young face at the very wrong moment, might be enough on any given day to mark him as the next to disappear. And so he learnt, dear listener, he learnt the one deep lesson that would shape and bend and define the whole of the rest of him, for as long as he would live. He learnt to hide. He learnt to take everything that he felt, all of the fear, and all of the grief, and all of the helpless, bottomless fury of a boy who had lost his father, and then his mother, and then his brothers, and very nearly his entire world, and to fold it all down and down again, and to lock it away somewhere very deep beneath a calm and pleasant and untroubled and entirely convincing face. He learnt to smile while something inside him was quietly breaking. He learnt to praise and to flatter and to wait upon the very people who had destroyed everyone he loved. He learnt, above all, never ever, under any circumstances, to let a single living soul see what was truly moving and turning behind his patient eyes. There is a saying that came down from those who knew him in that time, that in all those long-watched years, not once did he let slip even the smallest sign of what he must surely have been feeling, that he wore his mask so completely and so perfectly that a writer of the age would say of him, looking back, that there had never been a better servant, nor ever afterward a worse master. And you can feel it, can you not, dear listener, even now, even across all of these long and silent centuries, how much that endless hiding must have cost a living human soul. How a child might pass through such a furnace and walk out of the far side of it, still breathing, still upright, still smiling his careful, pleasant smile, and yet carry away locked inside him forever a wound so deep that it would never, in all his life, find any way to close. And then, when the boy was about 19 years old, the old emperor sent for him at last, and had him brought out across the bright water to the island of Capri, to live there in the high cliffside palace, beneath his own cold and constant and watchful eye. And only imagine that, dear listener. Only try, softly, to imagine it. Imagine being 19 years old, having watched your entire family quietly destroyed by the will of one single old man, and then being summoned to come and live within that very man's house, to sit at his very table, to walk in the gardens at his side, day after day, season after season, year after long year, with your true face folded away and locked down deep, and your pleasant careful mask fixed always in its place, knowing all the while that the silent old man across the table from you holds your single life balanced in the palm of his hand, and might choose, on any quiet morning, for any reason or for no reason at all, simply to close that hand. The island itself was famously and almost unbearably beautiful. All blue water and white sun-warmed rock, and air heavy with the scent of flowers and the sea. One of the loveliest places in all the wide world. And the young man lived there in all that beauty and in all that terror for years, smiling, agreeable, patient, careful, watchful, waiting, hiding, while the old emperor grew ever older and stranger and harder in his lonely palace high above the shining sea. It was a forge, that beautiful island. It was a place of heat and of pressure, and in that heat and under that pressure something deep within the young man was hammered slowly and silently into its final and lasting shape, and we shall never fully know what that shape was, nor how much of all that came afterward was already there inside him, formed and waiting, by the time he at last came down again from that high and terrible place. But he survived it. That much we know. he outlasted the silent old man. And when at last, in that warm spring of the year 37, the old Emperor Tiberius lay dying in his cliffside palace above the sea, it was the young man with the carefully hidden face, little boots, the last surviving son of the beloved Germanicus, who stood quietly ready at last to inherit the entire world. And so we come, dear listener, gently back around to where we first began, to the warm spring dusk, and the waiting hopeful city, and the great joy about to break over it like a wave. For when the news of the old man's death came across the water to Rome, the city went, quite simply, wild with happiness. The hated and dreaded old emperor was gone at last, and into his empty place was coming the beautiful young son of the one man they had loved best of all in the whole world, and it was as though their old grief itself had somehow been reversed and undone, as though the beloved Germanicus had come walking back to them at last in the living person of his child. They poured out into the streets in their countless thousands. They wept but now for joy. They called the young man their star, and their chick, and their baby, and their darling, the tenderest names they had. They lit fires upon the altars, and made glad sacrifices, and decked the temples and the doorways with garlands and with flowers. And when at last he came in person into the city, the crowds that surged out to meet him were so vast and so utterly delirious with love and relief, that the writers who tried afterward to describe it could scarcely find the words. He was 24 years old. The whole world adored him without reservation. The long dark watched years of hiding and of fear were finally over, and the future lay open and endless and golden before him. And for a little while, dear listener, for one brief and genuinely shining season, it truly was every bit as wonderful as all those hopeful weeping crowds had dreamed that it would be. For in those first bright months, the young emperor did, by every account, everything right. He was generous, lavishly and joyfully and open-handedly generous, pouring out gifts and money to the soldiers and to the common people of the city. He was merciful and forgiving. He recalled the men and women who had been driven away into exile during the long bad years, and he brought them home again. He put an end to the grim and poisonous treason trials that had darkened and terrified the city all through the old man's reign, and he gathered up the cruel secret records of all those old proceedings, the files and the accusations and the testimony, and he burned them publicly in the open forum, where everyone could stand and watch them turn to ash, declaring aloud that he himself had read none of them, and that no man in Rome need ever again lie awake at night, fearing that the emperor held some hidden accusation against his name. He honoured with great and visible tenderness the memory of his lost mother and his lost brothers, sailing out himself across the water to gather up their scattered remains, and bringing them home again with solemn ceremony, and laying them to rest at last with all the honour that they had been so cruelly denied. He put on magnificent games and shows and spectacles for the delight of the people, of a scale and a splendour that the city had not seen in many long years. He was modest and approachable, and warm and charming and easy, and the people who had loved him helplessly before he had so much as done a single thing, now loved him with every reason in the world, and the whole vast machinery of the Roman state turned and hummed along in a warm golden glow of goodwill and gratitude and relief, and it must surely have seemed, in those first golden months, that a new and gentle and happy age had truly dawned at last over the world, and that the long nightmare was finally, and forever behind them all. But the wound was still there, dear listener. The wound was still there, all the while, locked away and unhealed deep beneath the pleasant and the smiling face. All of the fear, and all of the grief, and all of the long unbearable years of hiding and of dread, folded down and down and down, and never once, in all that time, allowed to come out into the light, It had not gone anywhere. It had not dissolved. It was only waiting, the way it had always waited, patient and silent in the dark. And then, in the autumn of that very first golden year, just a few short months into the bright new reign, while the whole adoring world still basked and warmed itself in the glow of him, the young emperor fell ill. And it was a grave illness, a serious one, the kind that empties out the marble temples with crowds of frightened praying citizens and fills the streets with anxious whispering. For days, and perhaps for longer, the young emperor hung in the balance between life and death, while the whole holding its breath city waited in dread for the news that might come at any hour. And in the end, against the fear of everyone, his body fought its way back. The fever broke. He rose again from the sickbed. He lived. But the man who rose, dear listener, the man who at last walked out of that long burning fever and back into the pale thin light of the autumn day, was not, by every account that has come down to us across the centuries, entirely the same man who had lain down into it. Something had moved. Something deep behind the patient eyes had shifted in the dark and the heat of the fever, and it would never, afterward, quite shift back. And the golden season was over, though no one yet knew it. And the long, strange, creeping darkness that all those cheering crowds could never, in their happiest dreams, have imagined, was, at last, and very quietly, beginning to fall over the world. For in the months and the years that followed his rising from that sickbed, the young man who had hidden everything for so long, who had folded all his fear and all his grief away so deep and so completely for the whole of his watched and frightened life, began, slowly and then less slowly, to let the locked door swing open. And what came out of it, dear listener, after so very long behind the careful mask, was not gentle. The man who had once burned the records of the old trials and sworn that no one need fear him, now began to fear himself, in his turn, exactly as the old man on the island had feared before him, to see rivals and enemies and plots gathering in every shadow and behind every smiling courtier's face, and the grim proceedings that he had so publicly ended began, very quietly, to return, and men who had felt themselves safe began once again to feel the cold breath of dread upon the back of the neck. He grew, the writers tell us, by turns lavish and cruel, generous and terrible, charming and fearsome, swinging between the warmth that had made the whole world love him, and a hardness that made that same world begin, slowly, to grow afraid of him. He spent, and he spent, and he spent, pouring out the vast wealth that the careful old man had hoarded for so long upon games and gifts and wonders and spectacles, until the great treasury that had seemed so bottomless began, against all belief, to run low, and the spending could not stop, and so the search began for new ways to fill the coffers back up again. And the search for money in the hands of a frightened and unchecked ruler is very rarely a gentle thing for those who happen to have any. And he began, dear listener, to reach for something stranger still, something that had never quite been reached for in just that way before. For a Roman who had risen to rule the whole of the world, and who had no one left living above him, and no one beside him whom he could trust, and a wound inside him that no amount of power could ever fill, the boy who had once been so small and so frightened and so helpless began at last to imagine that he was not merely a man at all, but something more, something higher, something divine. He began, the stories say, to set himself among the gods, to speak of himself, and to have himself spoken of, not as a mortal ruler, but as a living deity walking the earth. He would, it was said, withdraw to commune privately with the gods, as though with his own equals and companions, and there were tales told of how he would speak to the great statues of the gods, as one god speaks to another, and even in the strangest of the tales of how he had the revered head struck from a famous statue of a god, and his own likeness set upon the holy shoulders in its place. Whether every one of these tales is wholly true, or whether some grew in the telling, in the way that the tales about the fallen and the hated always grow, we cannot now fully untangle. But this much is clear, dear listener, that here was a man who had been so powerless for so long, and so afraid for so long, and so unable for so long to let anyone see his true face, who now, with the whole world laid helpless beneath his hand, reached past the world entirely, and reached for the heavens themselves, as though even the rule of all the earth were somehow still not enough to fill the cold hollow place that all those lost and hidden years had carved in him. And the wonders that he built and staged in those years were wonders indeed, lavish past all reason, beautiful and strange, and ruinously costly. There were the great pleasure ships, the floating palaces that he had built to drift upon the still waters of a lake, fitted out, the old accounts insist, with every luxury that the world could offer, with warm baths and shaded colonnades and gardens and vines growing aboard them, vast and gorgeous and pointless, simply because he could, simply because there was no one left to tell him no. And there was, most famous of all, the great bridge of boats across the bay. For it is said that he gathered together a vast multitude of merchant ships, and had them anchored side by side in a long unbroken line, clear across a wide stretch of open sea, between the shore at Babiae and the harbour mole beyond, and had a roadway of earth and timber laid across all their decks, mile upon mile of it, a road across the very surface of the sea. And then, dressed in splendour, he rode his horse out across that floating bridge of boats, back and forth above the deep water, before the astonished and uncomprehending eyes of the whole gathered crowd. Some said he did it to amaze the world, some said he did it to mock an old prophecy that he would no more become emperor than he could ride a horse across that very bay. And whatever the reason was, it stands as perhaps the truest picture of him that we have, dear listener, this image of a frightened and wounded and unfathomable young man riding a horse across the surface of the sea, simply to show that he could do the impossible, simply because there was no longer anyone left alive in all the world with the power or the courage to stop him. And then there is the horse. For of all the strange tales that cling to his name, the one that has lasted longest and travelled furthest is the tale of his beloved horse, a magnificent racing animal that he is said to have loved beyond all sense and all proportion. He lavished upon this horse, the accounts say, a life finer than that of almost any man in Rome. He is said to have given the animal a stable of gleaming marble, and a manger carved of ivory, and coverings of purple, and a collar set with precious stones, and even, in the most famous version of the tale, a household of its own, with servants and furnishings, so that guests might be invited and entertained in the horse's name. And it was said, dear listener, whispered through the frightened and the resentful city, that he meant one day to raise the very horse to the highest office in the state, to make the animal a consul of Rome, to set a beast in the seat that the proudest and the noblest men of the city spent their whole lives striving to reach. Whether he ever truly meant to do such a thing, or whether it was only a bitter jest, a way of telling the proud senators of Rome exactly what he thought of them and of their dignity, that he held them so cheaply that he might as well give their highest honour to his horse, we cannot now be sure, but the tale endured, because it captured something, a sense that here was a man for whom all the old rules, all the careful dignities and limits and decencies that had bound Rome together for so long, had simply ceased to mean anything at all. A man who had been so wounded by the world that he now seemed to take a strange cold pleasure in showing that wounded world that he no longer cared for any of it. But power of that kind, dear listener, power without limit and without trust and without love, is a lonely and a dangerous thing for the one who holds it, and a frightening thing for everyone who must live in its shadow. And as the months wore on, the fear in Rome thickened and spread, and the men around the emperor, the great senators and the officers of his own guard, began to lie awake at night, and to wonder which of them might be next to feel his cold and sudden displeasure, and to whisper very carefully, in twos and threes, in shadowed rooms, the kind of whispers from which conspiracies are quietly born. For he had wounded too many, and frightened too many, and humiliated too many, and trusted too few, and a ruler who has made the whole world afraid of him has, in the end, made the whole world his enemy, and needs only to turn his back once on the wrong man. And among those nearest him, among the very officers of the guard, sworn to keep his body safe, there was at least one who had been mocked and stung past bearing by the emperor's cruel and careless tongue, and who now began, with others, to make a quiet and terrible plan. And so it came at last, dear listener, on a winter day not yet 4 full years into that reign which had begun in such golden joy, in a narrow covered passage beneath the palace, away from the crowds and the light. There, in that close and shadowed corridor, the men of the plot closed in around the young emperor, and there swiftly it was done, and the little Boots, the small grave child who had once marched so proudly about the cold camp on the Rhine, the beloved son of the beloved Germanicus, the frightened boy who had survived the silent island and worn his careful mask for so very long, was, at 28 years of age, gone out of the world, and the news of it ran out through the palace and through the city. And there were those who could not at first believe it, who thought it some cruel trick or test, so strange had the world become under him. But it was true. The reign of little Boots was over, and the great wheel of Rome, which had been turning long before he was born, and would go on turning long after, ground slowly onward into whatever was to come next, as it always had, and as it always would. And so what are we to make of him, dear listener, now, here, in the quiet and the dark, with the whole long story laid out before us, and the cheering crowds and the marble palaces all turned to dust 2,000 years ago? The legend gives us a monster, a madman, a byword for cruelty and excess, and there is truth enough in that, and we need not pretend there is not. But underneath the legend, if we are gentle and if we are patient, we can also dimly make out something else, something quieter and far more human and far more sad. We can make out a small boy in little boots, adored by an army, carried about a cold camp by a father who loved him. We can make out that same boy, suddenly and forever fatherless at 7, watching his whole warm world emptied out person by person around him. We can make out a frightened young man on a beautiful and terrible island, smiling his careful smile across the table at the very man who held his life, learning to fold everything he felt down deep where no one could ever see it, paying that unimaginable price year after year after year. And we can perhaps begin to understand, even if we can never excuse, how a soul so wounded, so frightened, and so long denied, when at last it was handed the whole of the world, and told that there was no one left who could ever say no to it again, might come undone in just the strange and terrible ways that this one did. For power, dear listener, does not so much change a person as it reveals them, and it reaches down into whatever was already there, the gentleness or the wound, and it draws that thing slowly up into the light, and lets it grow without limit. And what was already there, in the boy in the little boots, after everything that the world had done to him, was a wound very deep and very old, and beyond any healing. So let him rest now, the little boots, 2,000 years gone, the frightened child beneath the monster's mask, his marble palaces fallen, his floating ships long since sunk into the silt, his beloved horse only a story now drifting down the centuries. Let the whole great anxious, cruel, and golden world of him sink softly down and away into the dark, the temples and the crowds, and the long passage beneath the palace, all of it quiet now, all of it still, all of it long, long over, and let your own breathing slow, and let your own shoulders fall, and let the warmth gather around you here in the safe and ordinary dark, far from all of that, 2,000 years and a whole world away, and let yourself drift gently and without any fear at all down toward sleep. Stay with me a little while longer, dear listener, in that same great city of white marble and warm dust and endless murmuring crowds, for the wheel of Rome turns slowly onward through the years, and the strange and golden and sorrowful tale of the family of the Caesars is not yet finished telling itself. The little Boots had come and gone, and others had risen and fallen in his place, and now we come to another name that the centuries have wrapped in fire and in horror, another young ruler remembered as a monster, a byword spoken even now with a shudder. And once again, dear listener, if we are gentle, and if we are patient, and if we let the loud and terrible legend drift away like smoke into the dark, we will find underneath it something quieter and stranger and far more human than the story we were told. So settle in again, let your breathing slow once more, and come with me a little deeper into the long Roman night, and we will see what was really there. Imagine then a child born into the very heart of that ruling family in the year we call 37, a small boy with a famous and ancient name, born to a hard and unloved father, and to a mother who was perhaps the most formidable woman of her whole age. For his mother was a great-granddaughter of the first and greatest of the emperors, and she was beautiful, and she was brilliant, and she was patient, and she was utterly without fear. And hij the first ten viermi habien the thien in o, sombien in vier, thien in vier me, thien in vier me, thien in vier me, thien hen in vier habien the nas, thien en thien vien vier me, thien in vier me, thien vier me, would one day rule the entire world. And she would spend the rest of her life pursuing that dream with a will of iron and a patience that nothing could exhaust, moving the pieces of the great game year after year with a cold and steady hand. And the boy grew up inside that dream, the way a plant grows up inside a glass house, shaped by it, warmed by it, and never once entirely free of it. It was not a safe family to be born into, dear listener, nor a gentle one. His own father died when he was very young, and the dangerous tides of the court swept his mother for a time away from him into exile, and the boy was left for a while poor and overlooked and very nearly forgotten, a child of the great family living almost in the shadows. But his mother was not a woman to stay in any shadow for long. When the wheel of Rome turned again, and a new emperor came to the throne, an aging and learned and rather lonely man, she returned from her exile, and she set herself with all her formidable will to the long patient task of climbing back to the very centre of power. And climb she did. She climbed until she had married the aging emperor himself, and become the first lady of the whole Roman world. And from that high place she turned all her attention to the one thing that had always mattered to her above every other, the raising up of her son. She arranged with great skill and patience to have the old emperor adopt the boy as his own and name him among his heirs, setting him ahead, in the order of things, of the emperor's own younger natural son, a quiet and watchful child who now stood, through no fault of his own, directly in the way of the great dream. And she gave her son the very finest teachers that the world could offer, among them one of the wisest and most famous philosophers of the age, a gentle and eloquent man who would try for years with all his learning and all his patience to shape the boy into a good and just and moderate ruler, and who would in the end be swept away by the very storm he had tried so hard to calm. And then, dear listener, the aging emperor died. The accounts that have come down to us are full of dark whispers about how exactly that death came, whispers of a poisoned dish at a quiet supper, whispers that the patient and formidable mother, seeing her son at last upon the very threshold of the throne, did not wish to leave the final step to the slow uncertainty of nature. Whether any of that is true, or whether it is only the kind of dark tale that always gathers around the sudden death of the powerful, we cannot now untangle. But the old emperor died, and in the confusion and the grief and the careful arrangement of that night, it was the boy, just 16 years old, who was brought out before the soldiers of the guard, and hailed as the new ruler of the Roman world, while the old emperor's own quiet natural son was left behind in the shadows of the palace, and the great dream of the formidable mother came true at last. Her son was emperor. He was 16 years old, and she stood close behind him, very close, the true power behind the smooth young face, certain in her heart that she would now rule the world through the child she had spent her whole life raising up for exactly this. And for a little while, dear listener, just as it had been in other golden seasons before, it seemed as though something wonderful had truly begun. For in those first years the young emperor, guided by his wise old teacher, and by a steady and honest officer of the guard, governed gently, and well, and generously. He cut the heavy taxes that had ground upon the people. He was merciful and forgiving and easy. He gave magnificent games and shows and gifts. He listened to wise counsel, and the great affairs of the empire were managed with care and with justice. And these first years were remembered ever afterward, even by those who came to hate him most, as a brief shining time of good and peaceful rule, a small golden age. And the young emperor himself was, in these years, charming and warm, and eager to be loved for more than anything in all the world. Dear listener, this young man wished to be loved and admired and adored, not feared but adored, and in those first years it seemed that he might truly have it, but he was not, at heart, a man who longed for the hard grey labour of ruling. What he longed for, with his whole soul, was something quite different and quite unexpected in a ruler of Rome, and it would be the truest and strangest thing about him all his life. For this young emperor longed, above all things, to be an artist. He loved music and poetry and the theatre and the roar and thunder of the chariot races with a deep and genuine and almost helpless passion. He wished to sing and to play upon the lyre and to drive the racing chariots himself, and to stand before great crowds not as their master but as their performer, and to hear them cheer him and love him, not because he ruled them, but because he had moved them, because he was beautiful, because he was good. There was something almost touching in it, dear listener, this dream of a young man who held the whole world in his hand, and wanted, more than the world, simply to be applauded as an artist. But it was also, for a ruler of Rome, a kind of slow disaster, for the proud old families of the city held such performing in the deepest contempt, regarding it as fit only for slaves and for the lowest sort of people, and the spectacle of their own emperor longing to mount the public stage and sing filled them with a horror and a shame that would, in the end, help to bring him down. And as the young emperor grew older, and grew more sure of himself, and grew more impatient of all the wise and steady hands that had guided him, the long struggle began, the struggle that would slowly poison everything, the struggle between the son and the mother who had made him. For she had raised him up to rule the world through her, and he had no wish, as he grew, to be ruled by anyone, not even, perhaps especially not, by her. And the great formidable will that had set him on the throne now turned, slowly, from his greatest support, into the one thing he could not bear, the one shadow he could not escape, the watching, judging, controlling presence that stood always just behind him. Their love cooled and curdled, and turned at last to something cold and frightened and terrible on both sides. And the young emperor, who wanted only to be free, and to be loved, and to be adored, came to feel that he could be none of those things while she still lived. And so, dear listener, after much fear and much hesitation, and at least one dark plan that failed, the unthinkable was finally done, and the patient and formidable mother, who had risked everything and schemed everything, and given her whole life to set her one son upon the throne of the world, met her end at the will of that very son. It is among the darkest deeds in all the long dark history of that family, and the accounts tell us that he was haunted by it ever afterward, that he could not sleep, that he started at shadows and was pursued in his dreams. And whether that is true, or only what we wish to be true, it is at least the picture history has left us, of a young man who had crossed a line that no one can ever uncross, and who was never afterward entirely whole again. For after that, dear listener, something seemed to give way in him, the way it had given way in others of his line, the last restraints falling one by one. The wise old teacher, who had laboured so long to make him good, withdrew at last from the court, weary and despairing, and would in time be swept away entirely. The steady, honest officer of the guard died, and was replaced by harder and crueler men, and the young emperor, freed now of every hand that had ever held him back, gave himself more and more completely to his pleasures, and to his art, and to his endless hunger to be adored, while the hard business of ruling the world drifted further and further from his care. He spent without limit, pouring out the wealth of the empire upon spectacles and feasts and wonders. He set aside one wife and took another, and the shadows of those discarded and unhappy queens too fell across the dark accounts of his reign. And more he turned to the stage and to the racetrack, performing now openly before the people of the city, singing his long songs upon the public stage, hour after hour, while the great crowds, it is said, were not permitted to leave until he had finished, some of them feigning death, the old story goes, simply to be carried out and escape. He toured the great cities and the ancient festivals, competing as a singer and a charioteer, gathering up crowns and prizes that no one quite dared to deny him, certain in his own heart that he was the greatest artist of his age, drinking in the cheers, while far behind him the unwatched empire began, very slowly, to come apart. And then, dear listener, came the fire. For in the heat of high summer, in the great crowded ancient city of wooden tenements and narrow winding streets and shops packed close together, a fire broke out near the great racetrack in the dry dark of the night. And it caught, and it spread, and it ran, leaping from roof to roof and street to street, driven on by the summer wind, and it grew into something that the city had never seen, a vast and roaring sea of flame that swept through quarter after quarter, devouring the homes of the poor and the palaces of the rich alike, sending up a column of smoke that could be seen for miles, and the people fled before it in their countless thousands, out into the fields and the tombs beyond the walls, clutching what little they could carry, while behind them the eternal city burned. For days and days it burned, dear listener, beyond all the efforts of all the men who fought it, until great swaths of the old city were nothing but ash and smoking ruin, and the blackened bones of fallen houses, and an enormous multitude were left with nothing at all, no home, no shop, no shrine, no roof against the sky. It was one of the greatest disasters that the city had ever known. And where was the emperor while his city burned? The truth, dear listener, the careful, sober truth, seems to be that he was away from the city when the fire began, at a town along the coast, and that when the news reached him he hurried back, and that he then did much of what a ruler should do, throwing open his own gardens and buildings to shelter the homeless, bringing in food, organizing relief, and planning afterward to rebuild the city in a finer and safer way, with wider streets and stone in place of wood. But that is not the story that the city told, and it is not the story that has come down to us through the centuries. For the people, frightened and ruined, and looking for someone to blame, whispered that the emperor himself had set the fire, that he had wished to clear away the cramped old city to build himself a grander one. And the most famous and most terrible image of all took root, the image of the emperor standing high above the burning city, dressed in the costume of a stage performer, lyre in hand, singing a long song about the burning of an ancient and legendary city of old, while his own real city died below him. Whether he ever did such a thing, dear listener, the careful historians have doubted ever since, and it may well be nothing but a dark and perfect legend, the kind that fastens itself forever onto the hated. But it captured something that the people felt to be true about him, that here was a man so lost in his own performance, so in love with his own art and his own glory, that he might fiddle and sing while the whole world burned around him, and never truly notice. And that image has outlived everything else about him, and burns still, 2,000 years later, in the dark. And then the emperor did a terrible thing, dear listener, a thing far darker than any song. For the dangerous whispers that he himself had set the fire would not die down, and he sought desperately for some way to turn the anger of the people away from himself, and he found it, as frightened and cornered rulers so often do, by turning it instead upon the helpless. There was in the city at that time a small and new and little understood community of believers, a quiet people following a new faith, few in number, harmless, keeping mostly to themselves, and already regarded with suspicion and dislike by many, simply for being strange and new. And upon these people, dear listener, the emperor cast the blame for the great fire, and they were seized, and they were made to suffer, terribly and publicly and unjustly, for a crime that they had never committed, simply because they were few, and friendless, and convenient, and easy to hate. It is a dark and shameful stain upon his name, one of the darkest, and history has never forgotten it, nor should it, and we will not linger over the cruelty of it here in the gentle dark, only mark it, and mourn it, and pass on, remembering those nameless suffering people far more kindly than the age that wronged them ever did. And out of the ashes of the burned city the emperor built, for himself, a wonder. For he took a vast stretch of the ruined heart of the city, where the homes of the people had stood, and there he raised an enormous and unimaginably lavish palace, a golden house, with halls clad in gold and gems and mother of pearl, with ceilings that were said to shower flowers and perfume upon the guests below, with vast gardens and woods, and a great artificial lake, and pastures with grazing animals, an entire private countryside built in the very centre of the greatest city in the world, all for the pleasure of one man. And before it, the stories say, he raised a colossal statue of himself, towering many times the height of a man, gazing out over his golden domain. And when at last it was finished, and he moved into it, he is said to have remarked, with a kind of terrible innocent satisfaction, that now, at last, he could begin to live like a human being. And in that one remark, dear listener, you can hear the whole strange hollow centre of him, a man who held the entire world and an empire's wealth in his hands, and who felt even so, even surrounded by gold and gardens and adoring crowds, that something was still missing, that he had not yet truly begun to live, that the cold empty place inside him had still not been filled, and never would be, not by all the gold in all the world. But the world, dear listener, was growing tired of him at last. The proud old families, shamed by his singing and his racing and his excess, and frightened by the deaths that gathered around him, began at last to plot in earnest, and a great conspiracy formed among the noblest men of the city to be rid of him and to set another in his place. But the plot was discovered before it could strike, and the emperor's revenge was wide, and cold, and terrible, sweeping up not only the plotters but many others besides, the guilty and the merely suspected alike. And among those who were caught in that dark tide and made to die was the wise old teacher himself, the gentle philosopher who had laboured so long, so many years before, to make the frightened boy into a good and gentle man. And so the last link to those distant hopeful early years was broken, and the emperor stood now almost entirely alone, surrounded by fear and by flattery, and by the silence of men too frightened to tell him the truth, while out beyond the walls of his golden house the patience of the world ran slowly, finally, out. For the discontent had spread now far beyond the city, out into the great provinces and the frontier armies, and one by one the distant governors and generals, men with legions at their backs, began to turn against him, until at last even the great council of the city, sensing which way the wind had finally turned, declared him an enemy of the state. And the emperor, who all his life had wished only to be loved and adored, awoke one night near the end to find that the adoration was gone, all of it, that the guards had abandoned their posts, that the palace was emptying around him, that the great crowds who had cheered his singing now wanted only his end, and that he was, after everything, after all the gold and all the glory and all the crowns, entirely and utterly alone. He fled the city in the dark, with only a tiny handful of companions, to a humble house in the countryside outside the walls, and there, hunted, abandoned, hearing the hoofbeats of the riders coming for him, he understood at last that it was over, and that there was no longer any road left open but one. And it is said, dear listener, that as he faced that final dark hour, this strange and ruined young man, who had wished above all things in the world to be a great artist, who had longed his whole life only to be applauded and adored, spoke a few last words that have echoed down all the long centuries since, words full of his whole strange self even at the very end, mourning not his empire, nor his throne, nor the world he was losing, but only his art. What an artist, he is said to have murmured, the world now loses in me. And with that, the last of the great line that had ruled Rome since the very beginning, the family of the Caesars, from which had come the little boots, and the formidable mother, and so much glory, and so much sorrow, came at last to its end, in a humble room outside the walls, in the dark, alone. And so once again, dear listener, here in the quiet, with the whole long tale laid out before us, we are left to wonder what to make of him. The legend gives us a monster, a tyrant who burned his city and sang while it died, who murdered his own mother, who tormented the innocent, and there is truth enough in the darkness of him, and we need not pretend there is not. But underneath the legend, if we are gentle, we can also make out something quieter and stranger and far more sad. We can make out a small boy raised inside another's enormous dream, loved and used and shaped for a single purpose from the very first hour of his life, never once entirely free, never once entirely his own. We can make out a young man who held the whole world in his hands and wanted, more than the world, only to make beautiful things and to be loved for them, not feared but loved, applauded, adored. And we can perhaps begin to understand, even though we can never excuse, how such a soul, hollow at the centre and hungry for a love that no crowd and no crown could ever truly give, when handed the entire world and freed at last of every restraining hand, might come undone in just the strange and terrible ways that this one did. For power, dear listener, as we have seen before, does not so much change a person as reveal them, reaching down into whatever was already there, and drawing it slowly up into the light, to grow without any limit at all. And what was already there, in this strange longing young man, beneath all the gold and all the song, was an emptiness very deep and very old, that no amount of adoration would ever fill. Stay with me yet a while longer, dear listener, in that same vast and ancient city of marble and warm dust. For there is another tale to tell, as the long night deepens, and this one begins in a way that none of the others did. For this time we do not begin with a monster at all. This time we begin with the very best of men. We begin with a good and gentle and weary old ruler, perhaps the wisest man ever to hold the throne of the whole Roman world, a philosopher upon the seat of power, beloved and just and tireless. And we begin in the golden evening of his reign, when the empire stood at the very height of its long greatness, at peace within and strong without, ruled with patience and with wisdom and with care. And the tale we are going to tell, dear listener, is the tale of what came after him, and of the son he left behind. And it is perhaps the saddest tale of all the ones we have told, because it is the story of how the very best of fathers, who had everything and gave everything and tried with all his heart to pass on everything good that he knew, came in the end to leave the world in the hands of a son who threw it all away. So let the legend go once more, and settle in, and come with me gently into the lamplit dark of the philosopher's tent, where our story begins. For picture him first, the good old ruler, far away on the cold northern frontier, in a wooden fort among the legions, on a winter night near the end of his long life. The wars on that frontier had been hard and endless, the fierce tribes pressing always against the border, and the philosopher emperor, who would by every inclination of his soul have far preferred a quiet life of study and reflection, had spent year upon weary year of his old age out there in the mud and the cold, away from the comforts of the city, doing the hard and joyless duty that had fallen to him, simply because it had to be done. And on those long frontier nights, the stories tell us, when the camp had grown quiet, and the watchfires burned low, the old emperor would sit alone by the light of a single lamp, and he would write, not laws, and not commands, but small private thoughts to himself, gentle reminders of how a person ought to live, how to bear hardship with patience, how to meet death without fear, how to be just and kind and unmoved by anger, and how to remember always that all the glory of the world is fleeting and will soon enough be gone. He never meant for anyone else to read those quiet midnight thoughts. He wrote them only to steady his own soul against the cold, and yet they have come down to us across all the centuries, dear listener, those gentle private meditations of a tired good man writing by lamplight in an army camp at the edge of the world, and they are read and loved still by countless people as some of the wisest and most comforting words that any ruler ever set down. That was the Father. Hold him in your mind, dear listener, gentle and weary and wise, writing his small steady thoughts in the dark. For everything that follows is measured against him, and this good old man had a son. He had had many children, in truth, over the long years of his marriage, but it was a cruel age for children, even in the greatest of families, and one after another, so many of them had died small, in infancy or in early childhood, that the father had known a great deal of quiet private grief behind his calm philosopher's face. But one son had lived. One son had grown strong and healthy and golden where so many others had faded. And so all the hopes of the father, and all the hopes of the dynasty, came to rest upon that one surviving boy, the way that a great weight will come to rest upon a single beam. And the father loved him, and raised him in the purple with every care, and gave him the very finest teachers that the wide world could provide, the greatest scholars and orators and philosophers of the age, gathering them around the boy, so that he might grow up into a wise and good and worthy ruler, so that the golden age might continue unbroken into the next generation, so that all the patient good work of so many decades might be safely passed on into worthy hands. But the son, dear listener, did not take after the father. It happens so, sometimes, even in the best of families, even with all the love and all the care and all the finest teaching in the world. The boy was handsome and strong and athletic and physically magnificent, but the quiet deep things that had filled his father's soul, the love of wisdom, the patience, the sense of duty, the care for others above oneself, none of these seemed to take root in him, however carefully they were planted. He cared little for study, and less for the dull, hard, endless labour of ruling, and what he loved instead, from a very young age, was display, and pleasure, and physical glory, and the roar and excitement of the games. And the good father saw it, surely. The good father, who was nothing if not clear-eyed about the world and about people, must have seen, with a quiet and growing private dread, that his one surviving son, the boy upon whom everything now depended, was not the heir that the golden age required. And yet what could he do? There was no other son, there was no other heir of his own blood, and so the father did the only thing he could, which was to keep the boy close, and to take him out to the frontier, and to make him co-ruler at his side while he yet lived, hoping, perhaps, against the evidence of his own eyes, that the weight of the throne and the example of his own life might yet shape the boy into something better before it was too late. But time, dear listener, ran out, as it always does. For out there on the cold frontier, in the camp among the legions, the good old emperor at last grew sick, and weary, and ready, after his long and dutiful life, to lay his burden down. And as he lay dying, the stories tell us, calm and unafraid as he had taught himself to be, his greatest care was not for himself at all, but for the world he was leaving, and for the son into whose untried hands it was about to fall. And then the good old man died, there in the camp, far from the city, in the cold, and with him, though no one yet knew it, the long golden age of Rome died too, the long bright noontime of the empire's greatness, never to come again. For after him there would be no more of the wise good rulers who had held the world so carefully for so long. After him would come the son. And the son was about 18 years old, and now, suddenly, he was the sole master of the entire Roman world, with no father any longer at his shoulder, no hand any longer to guide or restrain him, and the whole vast machinery of imperial power laid open before him to use exactly as he wished. And the very first thing that he wished, dear listener, the very first great choice that he made as sole ruler of the world, told the whole story of everything that was to come. For his father had spent the last hard years of his life out on that frontier, fighting to secure the border, to finish the long war, to settle the dangerous tribes once and for all. And the work was very nearly done. The old generals urged, one more season, one more push, and the frontier would be safe for a generation. But the young emperor had no taste at all for the mud and the cold, and the hard joyless labour of the camps. What he longed for, with his whole heart, was Rome, the great city, with its pleasures and its comforts and its games and its adoring crowds. And so, against all the urging of his father's seasoned old commanders, the young man made a hasty peace, and abandoned his father's nearly finished work, and turned his back on the frontier, and went home to Rome to enjoy himself. And the old soldiers watched him go, dear listener, with heavy hearts, knowing that something had ended, that the careful, patient world they had served was passing away, and that they now served a master who cared for none of the things their old master had cared for, and everything for the things their old master had set aside. And in Rome, the young emperor gave himself, more and more completely as the months and the years went by, to pleasure and to leisure, and to every indulgence that the richest man in the world could command, while the actual hard work of ruling, the reading of reports, the hearing of disputes, the management of the vast and complicated empire, drifted steadily away from his attention and into other hands. For a ruler who does not wish to rule must still have someone to do the ruling, and so the young emperor came to lean upon a series of powerful favourites, trusted servants and officers who took the real burden of government upon themselves, and wielded the emperor's authority in his name, while he amused himself, and these favourites, holding such enormous power with so little check upon them, grew rich, and grew grasping, and grew hated, and ruled often harshly and corruptly, so that the resentment that gathered fell partly upon them, and partly, slowly, upon the careless young master who had handed them the world and looked away. And then, dear listener, came a thing that changed him, and hardened him, and turned the careless, pleasure-loving young man into something darker and more frightened and more dangerous. For not everyone in the great city was content to watch the golden age thrown away, and there were those among the proud old families, and even within his own kin, who came to feel that the young emperor must be removed before he ruined everything, and so a plot was hatched against his life. It was a clumsy plot in the end, and it failed, the story goes, almost before it began, the would-be assassin pausing, fatally, to make a grand speech announcing his purpose before he had actually struck, so that he was seized before the blow could land, and the young emperor survived. But he was never, afterward, the same. For the careless trust of his youth was gone now, shattered in a single instant, and in its place there grew a deep and gnawing fear. the same fear we have seen take root in others of these rulers, the fear that sees enemies in every shadow and plots behind every smiling face. And it was a fear made all the worse, perhaps, because this time the danger had come from within his own family, from those who should have loved him most. And out of that fear came suspicion, and out of suspicion came cruelty. And the young man drew further and further back from the ordinary business of the world, trusting fewer and fewer people, leaning more and more heavily upon his favourites and his pleasures, and growing year by year more isolated, more frightened, and more strange. And it was somewhere in those years, dear listener, in that growing isolation and that deepening strangeness, walled off from the real world behind his fear and his favourites and his endless pleasures, that the young emperor began, slowly, to dream a very strange dream indeed about who he truly was. For an ordinary man, even an ordinary emperor, was not enough for him to be, not any longer. The hard, dull work of being merely a ruler held no glory and no joy for him, and so he began to reach, as we have seen others of his line reach before him, past the ordinary world entirely, toward something vaster, and stranger, and more glorious, a new vision of himself that would consume him utterly in the years that remained, and would carry him, and the dignity of his great office, down into a spectacle that would scandalize the whole Roman world, and leave his name a byword for as long as that world was remembered. And what that strange new dream of himself was, and where it led him, we shall follow gently now, here in the deepening dark, as the long night settles down around us. For the young emperor, walled away behind his fear and his favourites and his endless pleasures, cut loose at last from every steadying hand that had ever held him, began slowly to believe that he was no ordinary mortal at all, no mere man who happened to wear the purple, but something far greater, something half divine. He came to imagine himself, dear listener, as the living return of the mightiest hero of all the ancient stories, the great strong man of the old myths, the slayer of monsters, the son of the king of the gods himself, come back to walk the earth again in the emperor's own person. And this was not some private fancy that he kept quietly to himself, the way a lonely man might dream. He proclaimed it, and he dressed it, and he built it in marble for the whole world to see. He took to appearing draped in the skin of a great lion, just as the old hero was always shown in the ancient images, with the snarling head of the beast drawn up over his own like a hood, and he carried with him a huge knotted wooden club, the hero's chosen weapon, and he had himself carved and cast in statue after statue after statue, in the hero's very likeness, the lion skin upon his shoulders, and the club resting in his hand, so that wherever a person turned in the great city, there the emperor was, gazing down from his pedestals, no longer as a ruler of men, but as a god among them, and being now, in his own mind, a kind of god and hero and divine founder all at once. He grew weary of the old plain names of things, the ordinary names that the city and the world and the very calendar had carried unchanged for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And so he began, dear listener, to rename them, all of them, after himself. He took the 12 months of the turning year, and he stripped away their ancient names, the names that had marked the seasons since before anyone could remember, and he gave them instead his own many names and his own grand titles, one after another, so that the very passing of the year itself, the turning of summer into autumn and autumn into winter, would now speak of nothing and of no one but him. He renamed the legions of the army after himself. He renamed the great fleet, and the grain ships that fed the hungry city, and the high and ancient council of the Senate, and even in the end the whole Roman people themselves, all of them now to be called by his name and his name alone. And at the very last, dear listener, in the deepest reach of this strange swelling dream, he turned to the greatest name of all, and he renamed the eternal city itself. He decreed that ancient Rome, the city of 1,000 years, the mistress of the whole known world, whose name was carved into the memory of every people on the earth, should no longer be called Rome at all, but should bear instead his own name, and be known henceforth as the colony of Commodus. Only imagine it, dear listener, softly, there in the dark. Imagine wishing to wipe away the name of the greatest city the world had ever known, a name worn smooth and bright by 10 centuries of glory and sorrow, and to scratch your own small single name across it in its place, the way a child might scratch his name into wet cement with a stick. There is something almost unbearably sad in it, is there not? Underneath all the madness of it, this endless hungry reaching for a greatness that no title and no statue and no renamed month and no renamed city could ever truly give him, this bottomless ache to fill a hollow place inside that simply could not be filled, no matter how much of the world he poured into it. But of all the strange and troubling things that he did in those years, dear listener, the strangest of all, and the one that shocked and shamed the proud old city to its very core, was what he chose to do down in the great arena, before the watching eyes of all the people. For being now, in his own imagination, the mighty hero, the slayer of beasts and monsters, he was no longer content merely to sit high above the games, in the marble seat of honour, watching as every emperor before him had always watched. No, he wished to go down himself, down into the sand, down into the arena, and to fight. And so, to the horror of the great families and the bewilderment of the common people, he did. He came down, the ruler of the entire Roman world, into the very place where slaves and condemned criminals and the lowest and most wretched of all men were sent to struggle and to die for the amusement of the crowd. And there, upon that bloodied sand, before the whole astonished and uneasy multitude, the Emperor of Rome took up his weapons and made himself a performer. He fought, first, against the beasts. From every far corner of the wide empire, dear listener, strange and magnificent animals were gathered and brought to the city at vast expense. Lions and leopards and bears, great tusked elephants and tall striped creatures from the deserts of the south, all of them caged and shipped across the sea and the long roads, simply so that the emperor might come down and slay them with his own hand before the people, and call himself the great hunter, the new hero, the conqueror of monsters. And he did slay them, dear listener, in their dozens and their hundreds, though always, the accounts are careful to tell us, from a place of perfect safety, raised up out of the reach of any claw or tusk, or with the animals already hemmed in and helpless, so that there was no true danger to him at all, only the appearance of it, only the spectacle, only the glory. And then he fought as a gladiator, man against man, taking up the sword and the shield, and going against trained fighters upon the sand. But here too, dear listener, it was all arranged, all of it, for he could not be allowed to lose, and he could not be allowed to come to harm. And so his opponents, who knew well that their own lives depended upon it, would fight only for show, and then yield and fall back, and let the emperor stand victorious over them to the forced roaring of the crowd. And he kept count, the stories say, a careful, jealous count, of his hundreds upon hundreds of arranged and certain victories. And he came to style himself in deep and genuine earnest the greatest fighter who had ever lived, the champion of champions, drinking in the cheers as though they were truly given, as though they were truly his. And here is a thing, dear listener, that shows the whole strange shape of him as clearly as anything could. For he charged the city for the privilege of watching him perform. Each time he came down into the arena to fight, he demanded an enormous fee from the public treasury, a vast sum of the empire's own money, paid to himself simply for appearing, so that the state was made to bleed out its wealth in great rivers in order to pay its own emperor to play at being a gladiator before crowds who did not dare to stay away. And the great senators of the city, the proud descendants of the oldest and noblest families in all the Roman world, The very men who held public performing in the deepest contempt as something fit only for slaves were made to come and to sit, and to watch their emperor fight upon the sand like a hired man. And worse than that, they were made to chant his praises, to cry out together in his honour as he stood sweating and triumphant over his yielding opponents, to call him the champion and the hero and the god, knowing all the while that the smallest sign of scorn or weariness upon any of their faces might be enough to mark them out for his sudden and terrible displeasure. And so they sat, and they watched, and they cheered, the noblest men in the world, humiliated and frightened, hating every moment of it, and not one of them daring to be the first to fall silent. And all the while, dear listener, far beyond the roar of the arena, the real and ancient work of ruling the world, the careful, patient labour that his father had given his whole weary life to, lay neglected and rotting. The empire that the good philosopher king had held together with such love and such effort drifted now without a true hand upon it, while the favourites looted and quarrelled and rose and fell, and the treasury bled, and the frontiers strained, and a great sickness, a terrible plague, swept through the crowded city and carried off the people in their countless thousands, and the emperor played at being a god upon the sand. And this, dear listener, is what makes his tale perhaps the saddest of all the sad tales we have told tonight. For the others we have met came up in their own strange and broken ways, were forged by fear and by loss into the things that they became. But this one was given everything. He was given the wisest and the gentlest and the most beloved father in all the world, a father who loved him and laboured over him, and surrounded him with the finest teachers the age could offer, and who handed down to him, whole and shining, and at the very height of its long greatness, the golden age itself, the best of all the empire had ever been or would ever be again. And he took that inheritance, that priceless and irreplaceable inheritance, and he poured it out upon the sand for the sake of the cheering of the crowd, and dressed himself in a lion's skin, and dreamed that he was a god, while the golden age died quietly in his careless hands and would never ever come again. And we should pause here a moment, dear listener, gently, and turn our eyes away from the emperor altogether, away from the sand and the lion skins and the marble, and think instead of the ordinary people of the great city in those years, the countless ordinary souls who lived and worked and slept beneath the long strange shadow of his reign. For while the emperor dressed himself as a god and slew his hundreds of beasts before the roaring crowds, the real life of the city went on, as the real life of cities always does, quietly, stubbornly, in the narrow winding streets, and the high crowded tenements, and the little shops, and the small warm rooms where families gathered at the end of the day. And it was not, in those years, an easy life to live. There had been a great fire that had swept through whole quarters of the city and left many with nothing but ash and the clothes upon their backs. There had been a terrible plague, a strange and merciless sickness that came, and faded, and came again, slipping into house after house in the dark, carrying away the strong and the weak and the young and the old alike, until there was scarcely a single family in all the city that had not laid someone they loved into the ground, and walked home again through the silent streets with the weight of that grief upon them. There had been shortages of bread, and hungry anxious crowds pressing in the markets, and the old gnawing fear of want that has haunted the poor in every age of the world. And over all of it, dear listener, like a low grey cloud that would not lift and would not break, there hung a feeling, whispered in the doorways and the bathhouses and the quiet corners where people felt safe enough at last to say what they truly thought. A feeling that something had gone very deeply wrong at the very heart of the world, that the gods themselves had somehow been offended, that the long golden noontime of peace and plenty had quietly soured and curdled and begun to turn, and that the strange god-dreaming emperor upon his far high throne was somehow the very sign and centre of it all, and the great old families, The proud houses whose names went back for centuries lived in those years in a particular and constant and wearing dread, never knowing from one morning to the next whose name might next be spoken in the emperor's anger, whose wealth might next be wanted, whose life might next be quietly required, so that the whole bright upper world of the city learnt to move carefully and to speak softly, and to smile its frightened careful smiles, and to wait, holding its breath, for a darkness that everyone could feel slowly gathering and no one quite dared to name aloud. It was a heavy time, dear listener, a watchful, fearful, weary, waiting time. And the people bore it as people have always borne such times, all down the long ages of the world, not with great speeches or grand gestures, but simply by going on, by rising again each grey morning to their work, by mending what could be mended, and carrying what had to be carried, by loving their children in the small warm rooms at the close of the day, and by lying down again each night when the dark came, and closing their tired eyes, and hoping very quietly, in the secret of their own hearts, that the coming morning might be a little gentler than the one before. And all the while, far above them, and far beyond them, the great slow wheel of things turned on, toward the end that was now at last drawing near. But the world, dear listener, grows weary at last of such men, as it always does, and the patience even of the most frightened people runs in the end into the sand. And as the years went on, and the emperor grew stranger and more suspicious and more terrible, even those who stood closest to him, the few trusted companions of his own household, the ones who had shared his table and his secrets and his pleasures, came to live in a constant and gnawing dread of him, never knowing from one day to the next whose name might fall from his lips into the dark list of those he meant to be rid of. And there came at last a night, the very last night of the year, when a small handful of those nearest to him, his own dear companions, came to understand, or came to fear, that their own names now stood upon that list, that the emperor meant to be done with them, and that if they did not act, and act swiftly, they themselves would not live to see the new year dawn. And so, cornered and desperate, and with nothing left to lose, they resolved that it was he who must go, and not they. The first attempt, with something slipped quietly into his cup, did not fully do its work, for he was young and strong and magnificent in body still, even at the end. And so, in the quiet of his own house, on that last dark night of the year, by the hands of one strong man, it was over. The emperor who had dreamed himself a god, who had renamed the world after himself, who had slain 1,000 beasts upon the sand, and called himself the greatest hero who ever lived, was, quite simply and quite quietly, gone. He was 31 years old, and with him, dear listener, something far larger than one strange young man passed out of the world. For he was the last of his great and golden line, the final heir of the long bright age of the good emperors, and after him there was no clear successor, no steady hand waiting to take up the world, and so the empire, leaderless and shaken, fell almost at once into a time of confusion and strife and grasping rivals, a dark and bloody scramble for the empty throne that would tear at the Roman peace in ways it had not known for generations. The golden age was not merely over. It was gone, and the long, slow, troubled centuries of decline had quietly begun, and they may be said, by those who look back across the long reach of history, to have begun on that last dark night of the year, in a quiet house, with the passing of the philosopher's lost and dreaming son. So what are we to make of him, dear listener, now, here, at the very end, in the warm and gentle dark, with the whole strange, sorrowful tale laid out at last before us? The legend gives us a madman in a lion's skin, a vain and cruel and ridiculous tyrant who fought slaves upon the sand and thought himself a god. And there is truth enough in that, and we need not pretend otherwise. But underneath the legend, if we are gentle, and if we are patient, we can make out something quieter and far more sad. we can make out a boy who was given, freely and lovingly, every single thing that a person could ever be given, the best of fathers, the best of teachers, the best of all possible inheritances. And who could not, for all of it, find within himself the one thing that mattered, the steadiness, the sense of duty, the quiet strength of soul that his gentle father had possessed and had tried so hard and so vainly to pass on. We can make out a hollow young man, frightened and adored and endlessly hungry, reaching past the whole world he had been given, toward the dream of being something more than a man, a hero, a god, anything at all that might fill the cold, empty place inside him, and finding, at the end of all his reaching, only the sand and the roar of the crowd and the knife in the dark. For power, dear listener, as we have seen now again and again through all the long hours of this night, does not so much change a person as reveal them, reaching down into whatever was already there, the strength or the emptiness, and drawing it slowly up into the light, to grow without any limit at all. And what was already there, in the philosopher's lost son, beneath all the marble and the lion skins and the thousand certain victories, was a hollow very deep and very old, that all the gifts of all the world could never fill. So let him rest now too, 2,000 years gone, the lost boy beneath the hero's mask, his 1,000 statues toppled and broken, his renamed city quietly become Rome once more the very moment he was gone, his golden inheritance scattered to the long centuries of decline. Let the whole great vain and sorrowful world of him sink softly down and away into the dark, the lion skins and the marble and the sand and the roaring crowds and the quiet house on the last night of the year, all of it still now, all of it silent, all of it long, long over. And let your own breathing slow once more, and let your own shoulders fall, and let the warmth gather close and kind around you here, in the safe and ordinary dark, 2,000 years and a whole world away from all of it, and let yourself drift gently and without any fear at all, down and down and down towards sleep. Come a little further with me into the long quiet night, dear listener, for the great wheel of Rome turns onward still through the years, and there is yet another tale waiting in the dark to be told, and this one, perhaps more than any we have told so far, is a tale of a family and of the terrible things that can take root and grow in the hearts of those who ought, of all people in the world, to love one another best. So settle in once more, let the warmth gather close around you, let your breathing slow, and let the small cares of your own long day loosen and drift away into the dark. And come with me now to meet two brothers, born together into the very heart of power, born to rule the whole of the world side by side, who came instead to hate one another with a hatred so deep and so old and so consuming, that it would end at last in the very worst thing that one brother can ever do to another. But to understand those two brothers, dear listener, we must first know the mother and the father who made them, for they were no ordinary parents, and theirs was no ordinary house. The father was a hard man, and a soldier to his very bones, a tough and shrewd and tireless general, born in a sun-baked province at the far edge of the empire, who had risen in a time of chaos and civil war, fighting his way up through blood and iron to seize the throne and to found a new ruling line, and who then held the whole vast Roman world together by the sheer force of his will and the loyalty of his armies. He trusted few things in this life, that hard old soldier, but he trusted his legions, and he trusted strength, and he had little patience and less tenderness for anything that was weak. And the mother, dear listener, was something altogether rarer and more remarkable. She came from the ancient East, from a line of priests and kings, and she was beautiful, and she was brilliant, and she was perhaps the most deeply learned woman ever to sit upon the Roman throne, a lover of philosophy and of poetry, who gathered around herself the finest thinkers and scholars of the age, a woman of great wisdom and great strength and great heart, and these two so different people, the hard old soldier and the brilliant Eastern queen, had 2 sons, and the whole sorrow of our tale grows out of those 2 boys. For from their earliest childhood, dear listener, the 2 brothers were rivals in all things. Whatever the one wanted, the other wanted also. Whatever the one won, the other could not bear to be without. In their games, in their lessons, in their horses and their friends and their father's favour, they competed and they quarrelled, and they grew jealous, as small children often will. And in most families such a thing softens with the years, and the brothers grow up and grow close, and put away the rivalries of the nursery. But not these 2. With them the rivalry did not soften. It hardened, it deepened, it curdled slowly, year by year, into something dark and bitter and absolute, a true and burning hatred, each brother coming to see in the other not a brother at all, but an enemy, an obstacle, a rival for the one thing that could not be shared. And as they grew toward manhood, the whole court itself began to divide around them. The courtiers and the officers and the servants drawn into one camp or the other, so that the great house was split, long before the worst came, into 2 wary and watchful factions, circling one another, waiting. The elder of the 2 brothers, dear listener, our chief subject in this tale, had about him one small and curious habit, by which, strangely, the whole world would come to remember him. For he was fond of a particular kind of garment, a long hooded cloak of a foreign cut, unusual in the city, and he wore it so constantly and made it so much his own that the people of Rome began to call him by a nickname taken from that very cloak. And it is by that nickname, dear listener, that he is known to this day, 2,000 years later, a name that means in truth nothing grander or nobler than a kind of hooded coat. There is a strange small echo in that, is there not? That this man, like another we have met tonight who was named for nothing more than a child's pair of little boots, should be remembered by all the ages, not by some title of glory, but by the humble name of a piece of clothing. The great and terrible ones, it seems, are so often pinned in our memory by the smallest and most human of things. Now the hard old soldier emperor, their father, spent the last years of his reign, as he had spent so much of his life, at war, and in his final campaign he led his armies, and brought his whole family with him, to the very far and misty edge of the known world, to a cold green island in the northern sea, to make war upon the wild and painted tribes of the far north, who would not bow to Rome. And it was there, dear listener, in that cold and distant land, far from the warmth of the south, that the old soldier at last grew sick and weary, and felt his strength failing, and knew that his death was near. And as he lay dying in a fortress at the edge of the world, he thought, as a father will, of his 2 sons, and of the bitter hatred between them that he had watched grow all their lives. And he was afraid of what that hatred might bring once he was gone and there was no longer any hand strong enough to hold them apart. And so he called them to him, and he gave them his last advice, 3 things only, distilled from a whole hard life of ruling. Be at peace with one another, he told them. Be generous to the soldiers, and care nothing for anyone else in all the world. Those were his final words of counsel to his sons, and they would remember the second of those 3 things, and they would remember the third. But the first, dear listener, the most important of all, the very thing he most longed for them to heed, they would forget the moment he had breathed his last. For when the hard old man was dead, the 2 brothers became, together, the joint masters of the entire Roman world, 2 emperors ruling side by side. And it was a disaster from the very first hour, for they could not bear so much as to be in the same room with one another. They returned to the great city, and took up residence in the vast imperial palace, but they divided it down the very middle, blocking up the doors and passages that joined the 2 halves, each brother dwelling in his own sealed portion, with his own guards and his own servants, each eating only food prepared by his own trusted hands, for fear of poison from the other, each sleeping behind locked and guarded doors, for fear of the knife in the night. They lived, in short, dear listener, as two armed and frightened enemies under a single roof, two camps in a state of cold and silent war. And so deep did this division run, that the two of them came, it is said, very near to splitting the whole empire itself between them, to drawing a great line across the Roman world, and taking the one half each, the lands of the rising sun for the one, and the lands of the setting sun for the other, dividing the inheritance of centuries, simply so that they might never again have to look upon one another's face. And through all of this, dear listener, there stood between them one figure, grieving and pleading, and refusing to give up hope, and that figure was their mother. For she loved them both, this brilliant and sorrowful woman, loved them both with all her heart despite everything, the elder and the younger alike, and it broke her to see them so set upon each other's destruction, and so she laboured with all her great wisdom and all her tireless will to bring her two sons back together, to make peace between them before the hatred swallowed them both, meeting with each of them, speaking to each of them, begging them to remember that they were brothers, that they were the only sons of the same mother and the same father, that they had no one in all the world so close to them as one another. She would not give up. She arranged meetings between them. She placed herself again and again in the very space between her two warring sons, hoping against all hope to close the terrible distance that had opened between them. And it was that hope, dear listener, that very love, that the elder brother used to do the unforgivable thing, for he had resolved at last, in the cold dark of his sealed half of the palace, that there was only one way that the long war between them could ever truly end, and that was for the other to be gone from the world entirely. And knowing that his brother was guarded, and watchful, and afraid, and would never come to him openly and unprotected, he did a thing of such coldness that the centuries have never forgiven it. He went to their mother. He told her that he was ready, at last, to make peace. He asked her to arrange a meeting between the two brothers, alone, in her own private chambers, on neutral ground, in her presence, so that the long quarrel might finally be set aside. And the mother, dear listener, the mother who had prayed for exactly this for so long, who wanted nothing in all the world so much as to see her two sons reconciled, believed him and rejoiced and brought them together. And the younger brother, trusting in his mother's presence, trusting that no harm could come to him there, in her own rooms, in her own arms, came to that meeting unguarded. And there, dear listener, the thing was done, for the elder brother had sent armed men, and at the appointed moment they fell upon the younger, and the younger brother, in his terror, fled to the only refuge left to him in all the world, to his mother, and threw himself into her arms, and clung to her, and the mother wrapped her arms about her child, and tried with her own body to shield him. But it was no use. And there, in his mother's very arms, with her holding him, the younger brother was struck down, and died, against his mother, his blood upon her, and the thing was done that could never, in all the world, in all of time, be undone. The two brothers, who had been born together into the heart of power, the only sons of the brilliant queen and the hard old soldier, were two no longer. There was one, and the mother had lost a son, murdered before her eyes, in her own embrace, by the hand of her other son. And here, dear listener, is perhaps the cruelest part of all, the part that tells you most clearly what kind of darkness now sat upon the throne. For the surviving brother would not even allow their mother to grieve. He forbade her to weep for her murdered child. He forbade her to mourn, to wear the signs of sorrow, to speak her dead son's name, to show upon her face so much as a shadow of the unbearable grief that was breaking her heart in two. She was made instead to smile. She was made to appear glad, to receive visitors with a cheerful face, to pretend before the whole world that nothing terrible had happened at all, while inside her a wound bled that would never close, mourning in total silence the son she had lost, forbidden even the small mercy of tears by the very son who had taken him from her. It is among the saddest things, dear listener, in all the long sad history of that family, the image of that brilliant and broken mother, holding her grief locked silent and frozen inside her, smiling her forced and frozen smile, because she was not permitted even to cry. And the surviving brother, now sole master of the world, set out to do something stranger still, something that the rulers of that age reached for when they truly hated, which was not merely to kill a man, but to erase him, to unmake him, to wipe him from the very memory of the world, as though he had never lived at all. He commanded that his dead brother's name be chiselled out of every inscription and every monument across the whole empire, scratched and hammered away until only a rough blank space remained where the name had been. He commanded that his brother's face be struck from the coins and scraped from the paintings, and that his statues be pulled down and broken, and that his very name be forbidden to be spoken aloud, anywhere, by anyone, on pain of death. And a great and terrible purge followed, sweeping across the empire, carrying away in its dark tide, not only those who had truly stood with the dead brother, but thousands upon thousands of others, merely suspected of having loved him, or favoured him, or felt a moment's sympathy for him, a great wave of fear and death that washed over the Roman world in the name of unmaking a man who was already gone. But here, dear listener, is the strangest thing of all about this haunted and bloody-handed man, the thing that lies at the very heart of him. Having done the unforgivable, having killed his own brother in his mother's arms, he could not rest. He could not sit still upon the throne he had killed to hold alone. Something in him would not let him remain in the great palace where it had happened, would not let him stay in the city, would not let him be at peace for a single hour. And so he fled. He fled from the palace, and from the city, and from his grieving, forbidden to grieve mother, and from the empty half of the divided house where his brother had once lived. And he fled into the one place where, perhaps, he could lose himself, into the army, into the camps, into the endless marching columns of the legions. He went to live among the common soldiers as one of them, sharing their plain food, marching on foot in the dust at the head of his troops, carrying his own gear, sleeping rough in the camps, labouring and sweating alongside the lowest legionary, generous to them with money and with praise, and they came to love him for it, the soldiers, this emperor who lived as a soldier and shared their hardships. For among the soldiers, dear listener, on the long roads, in the rhythm of the march, perhaps he could for a few hours be simply a soldier, and not the man who had murdered his brother in his mother's arms. Perhaps, out there in the dust and the noise and the endless movement, he could outrun, for a little while, the silence that waited for him whenever he stood still. And there was a kind of peace for him in that life, dear listener, or the nearest thing to peace that he would ever find. And it was deepest perhaps in the long nights of the march. For when the day's marching was done, and the great column of the legion came at last to its halting place, as the light failed, the soldiers would set about, with the long practised ease of men who had done it 10,000 times, the building of the camp, the digging of the ditch, and the raising of the rampart, the pitching of the rows of leather tents in their neat, unchanging lines, so that wherever the army stopped, even in the wildest and most distant land, there rose up in a single evening a small ordered city of canvas and earth, the same every night, familiar, safe, a little island of Rome, carved out of the dark unknown. And as the night came down, the fires would be lit, hundreds of small fires glowing in their rows across the camp, and the men would gather around them to eat their plain soldiers' food, and to warm their tired bones, and to talk in low voices of home, and of old battles, and of the women they had left behind, and of the rivers and the mountains still to cross, until one by one the talk grew quiet, and the fires burned down to embers, and the weary men wrapped themselves in their cloaks, and lay down upon the hard ground, and slept the deep and dreamless sleep of those who have walked all day, and will walk all day again tomorrow. And over the sleeping camp the stars would wheel, vast and cold and clear in the great dark sky, and the sentries would walk their slow rounds upon the rampart, and the only sounds would be the low crackle of the dying fires, and the stamp and shift of the horses, and the wind moving over the dark land beyond the ditch, and somewhere far off the cry of some night creature. And the whole army would lie quiet and breathing in the dark, 10,000 men asleep beneath the turning stars. But the emperor, dear listener, did not sleep, for he slept little and badly, and woke often in the deep of the night with his heart pounding and the dark pressing close. And so, in those long black hours, when the whole camp lay still around him, he would rise and wrap himself in his cloak like any common soldier, and walk. He would walk out among the rows of sleeping men, between the dim red embers of the fires, past the tents where his soldiers lay breathing in the dark, and there was a comfort in it for him, dear listener, a strange deep comfort, to walk among these rough and simple men, who asked nothing of him but pay and courage and a share in the hardship, who did not know or did not care what he had done in a far-off palace in his mother's chambers, who looked at him and saw only their general, their hard-marching, plain-living, open-handed commander, one of their own. Among them, in the dark, perhaps he could almost believe that he was only that, only a soldier among soldiers under the wheeling stars. But the nights are long, dear listener, and they are quiet, and in the quiet the things we have done come back to us, as they came back to him. And so, walking there among the dying fires, in the deep silence of the sleeping camp, with no march to make and no battle to fight, and no business of the day to fill his mind, the silence would find him, and the thing would rise again before him, his brother fleeing to their mother, his brother in her arms, the terror and the blood and the deed that could not be undone, and there was nowhere left to march to, nothing left to do, no further to go. And so he would simply walk and walk in slow circles through the sleeping camp, around and around beneath the cold stars, chased by the one thing in all the world that no army could defeat and no distance could escape, until at last, far off in the east, the sky would begin to pale and to grey toward another dawn, and the camp would begin to stir, and the trumpets would sound, and there would be marching to be done once more, and movement and noise and the blessed business of the day to fill the empty place, and he could stop for a little while remembering. That was his life, dear listener, the marching by day and the walking by night, always moving, never at rest, and he reached, dear listener, as so many of the haunted and the hollow have reached, for a borrowed greatness, a dream of being someone other than himself. He became consumed, utterly consumed, with the memory of a great young conqueror who had lived and died 1,000 years before his time, a golden youth who had marched out from a small kingdom to conquer the whole of the East, to reach the very edge of the world, and who had died young and undefeated, and passed into legend as the greatest conqueror who had ever lived. And the emperor came to long, with all his restless soul, to be that man, to be the conqueror reborn. He dressed himself in the fashion of that ancient hero, he carried himself in imitation of him, he gathered images of him, and surrounded himself with them, and formed his soldiers into the old formations that the hero had used, and dreamed of marching east to retrace those ancient conquests, and to win the same undying glory. A man, dear listener, running so hard and so far from what he had done, that he sought to escape even his own self, to dissolve into the shining image of a long-dead stranger, to be anyone at all, a great conqueror, a golden hero, anything but the brother who had done the thing that could not be undone. And yet, dear listener, and this is a thing we must be fair enough to remember, this same haunted and violent man, in the midst of all his darkness, did one single thing that outlasted every cruelty, one thing of such vast and lasting consequence that it changed the very shape of the Roman world for ever after. For he issued a decree, a single sweeping decree, by which he granted the precious and long-guarded gift of full Roman citizenship, with all of its rights, and all of its protections, and all of its dignity, to very nearly every free man and woman in the entire empire, to millions upon millions of people across 100 lands and 100 tongues who had never possessed it and never dreamed of possessing it, peoples of the east and the west and the north and the south, all of them made citizens of Rome together, at a single stroke of the pen. It was one of the most enormous and far-reaching acts that any ruler in all of history has ever made, an act that redrew the very meaning of what it was to belong to Rome, that bound the whole vast diverse empire together in a way it had never been bound before. The wise have argued ever since, dear listener, about why exactly he did it, whether out of some genuine breadth of vision or merely to widen the base of those who could be taxed, and the truth is likely tangled, as the truth so often is. But whatever moved him to it, the thing itself was real, and it was vast, and it endured long after he and all his cruelties had crumbled into dust, and so it too is part of him, and we should not in our remembering leave it out. For people are seldom only one thing, dear listener, even the darkest of them, and the same hand that did the unforgivable also did, almost in passing, one of the great and lasting things. But the old cruelty, dear listener, was never far beneath the surface, and it would rise again. For when, in his restless wandering, he came at last to a great and ancient and proud city of the East, a city famous for its learning and its sharp and mocking wit, the people of that city made the mistake of laughing at him, of mocking him openly for the killing of his brother, and for his strange pretensions to be the conqueror reborn. And his vengeance upon them, dear listener, was swift and terrible and merciless and indiscriminate, a dark and dreadful deed that fell upon the innocent and the guilty alike, and stained his name with a stain that has never washed away. We will not dwell upon the cruelty of it here in the gentle dark. We will only mark it and mourn for that proud old city and its people, and pass on, remembering that the man who could give citizenship to millions could also, when his pride was stung, visit horror upon a city full of souls who had done nothing worse than laugh. And yet in the great city of Rome itself, dear listener, he left behind him a wonder, a thing of beauty and not of horror, that has outlasted very nearly everything else about him. For he raised, for the people of the city, an enormous and magnificent palace of bathing, a vast complex of marble halls and soaring vaulted ceilings, and great pools of warm and cool water, of gardens and libraries and places to exercise and gather and rest, so grand and so beautiful and so immense in its scale that the people could hardly believe it, a gift to the whole city, where rich and poor alike could come to bathe and to ease their bodies and to pass the long afternoons. And so mighty was that great building, dear listener, that its towering ruins still stand today, 2,000 years later, roofless now and open to the sky, the broken arches reaching up enormous and silent into the air, a vast and beautiful skeleton of warm brick and crumbling marble, where once the people of the city laughed and bathed and were at ease, and where now only the wind and the centuries move through the empty halls. But he could not stop moving, dear listener. He could never stop moving. The restlessness that had driven him out of the palace drove him on and on, into war after war, and his armies carried him at last far away to the east, to make war upon the great rival empire of Persia, deep in lands far from home, far from the city, far from everything he had ever known. And it was there, on the march, in those distant eastern lands, that his own end found him at last, as it had found so many of the rulers we have met tonight, not on the field of battle in glory, but quietly and meanly and by treachery, for there were those close to him who feared him, and who plotted against him. And one day, upon a journey along a dusty road, far from any help, a single soldier who had been set on to the deed came upon him alone, and ended his life with one swift blow. There by the roadside, in the dust, under the great empty eastern sky. He was 29 years old, and the man who had arranged that death from the shadows stepped forward and took the empty throne for himself, and the haunted brother who had killed to rule alone, who had run so far and so hard from what he had done, came at last to rest in the only place where, perhaps, the running finally stops. And there remains, dear listener, one last sorrow to tell, and it is the sorrow of the mother, for she was still living, that brilliant and broken woman, when the news came to her that her surviving son, too, was dead, struck down far away by the roadside. And think, dear listener, gently of what that woman had now endured. She had borne 2 sons. She had watched them grow to hate one another. She had held her younger son in her own arms as he was murdered by her elder. She had been forbidden even to weep for him. And now her elder son, too, the one who had taken the other from her, was dead, killed far from home, and she had lost them both, the murdered and the murderer alike, both of her children gone, and nothing left to her at all. And it was more at last than even her great strength could bear. Already ill, already worn down by grief and by sorrow piled upon sorrow, she is said simply to have refused to go on any longer, to have turned her face away from a world that had taken everything from her, and to have let herself quietly fade and follow both her sons into the dark, choosing, at the end, an end of her own. And so that remarkable woman, the brilliant queen who had loved philosophy and poetry and her 2 doomed sons, passed out of the world, and her long sorrow was over. So what are we to make of him, dear listener, now, here, at the very last, in the warm and gentle dark, with the whole sad tale laid out before us? The legend gives us a fratricide, a brother-killer, a cruel and violent and haunted tyrant, and there is truth enough in all of that, and we need not pretend otherwise. But underneath the legend, if we are gentle, and if we are patient, as we have tried to be all through this long night, we can make out something quieter and stranger and far more sad. We can make out 2 small boys who should have been each other's closest companions in all the world, and who were poisoned instead, somehow, from the very cradle, by a rivalry that no one stopped in time, until it grew into a hatred that destroyed them both. We can make out a man who did the one thing that can never be taken back, and who then spent the whole brief remainder of his life running from it, into the army, into the dust of the endless roads, into the borrowed dream of being a long-dead hero, never able to sit still, never able to be at peace, because the thing he had done waited for him in every silence, and could not be outrun, however far or however fast he marched. For that, dear listener, is the deepest truth of him, perhaps, and the saddest. He could conquer cities, he could give citizenship to millions, he could raise great palaces of marble that would stand for 2,000 years, but he could not undo the one thing he had done, and he could not outrun it, and he could not forgive himself for it, and so he never rested, not for a single hour, until the roadside in the dust gave him at last the only rest he would ever find. For power, dear listener, as we have seen so many times now through this long and quiet night, does not undo the past, and it does not heal the wound, and it does not silence the thing that waits for us in the dark. It only gives us a wider world to run through, and more dust to raise, and further to go, before the running at last is done. So let him rest now too, 2,000 years gone, the haunted brother who could not be still, his hated brother's name scratched back now from the silence by the patient hands of history, his borrowed dreams of conquest faded, his great baths standing roofless and empty against the sky, his sorrowful mother at peace at last beside both her lost sons, Let the whole restless and grieving world of him sink softly down and away into the dark. The divided palace and the marching columns and the dusty eastern road and the brilliant broken mother holding her silent grief. All of it quiet now, all of it still, all of it long, long over. And let your own breathing slow once more, dear listener, and let your own shoulders fall, and let the warmth gather close and kind around you here in the safe and ordinary dark, 2,000 years and a whole world away from all of it, and let yourself drift gently and without any fear at all, down and down and down toward sleep. Come with me now, dear listener, a little deeper still into the long and quiet night, for there is one more tale to tell before the dark grows old, and this one is different from all the others we have told, and gentler and sadder in its own particular way. For this time we do not meet a hardened soldier, nor a hollow artist, nor a brother-killer running from his deed. This time we meet a child, a boy who was never meant to rule anything at all, who was snatched up out of a quiet and sacred life in a distant land and set, while he was still half a child, upon the throne of the whole Roman world, a throne he could not begin to understand, in a city that would never ever accept him. And so as we begin, dear listener, let us set aside, even more gently than before, the loud and lurid legend that the centuries have built around his name. For of all the rulers we have met tonight, this one was perhaps the most slandered, the most misremembered, the most unfairly used by those who told his story afterward. Let it all drift away into the dark, and come and meet instead the boy who was really there. For to find the beginning of his tale, dear listener, we must travel far from the great city of Rome, away to the warm and ancient East, to a sun-baked land of old temples and older gods, where a certain great and powerful family had its roots, a family of priests and queens, the very same family, in truth, that had given Rome the brilliant and sorrowful mother we met a little while ago in our last tale, the family of the formidable Eastern women. And in that family there was a boy, a grandson, a child being raised from his earliest years to a sacred and a solemn purpose. For he was the hereditary high priest of a great and ancient god, a powerful god of the sun, worshipped in that land since time out of mind, and worshipped, strangely, not in the form of a man or a beast as so many gods were, but in the form of a great black stone, a smooth dark cone of stone, said to have fallen long ago from the very heavens, a piece of the sky come down to earth, wholly beyond all telling. And the boy, dear listener, from the time he could walk, had been raised in the service of that god and that stone, dressed in rich and shimmering robes of silk and gold in the fashion of the East, taught the ancient rites and the sacred dances, so that he would appear before the altar of his god, a beautiful and exotic child, and dance and make the offerings and serve. It was the whole of his world, that temple and that god, and that sacred black stone. It was all he knew, it was who he was. For you must understand, dear listener, what that life truly was, and how completely it filled him and formed him from his earliest years, if you are to understand all that came after. The land of his birth was a warm and golden land, far away from the grey rains of the north, and far from the cold marble formality of Rome. A land of bright unending sun, and dry hills, and ancient cities older than memory itself, where the gods of the East had been worshipped in their own rich and colourful and passionate ways since the very dawn of the world. And in the great temple where the boy was raised, the temple of the sun god, all was splendour and warmth and devotion. The holy black stone stood enshrined in the innermost and most sacred place, the smooth dark cone of stone that had fallen, so the old priests had always taught, from the very sky itself in some distant and forgotten age, a fragment of heaven come down to dwell among men, and it was adorned with gold, and set about with precious gems, and draped in rich embroidered cloths, and before it the eternal fires burned, and the sweet grey smoke of costly incense rose up day and night, year upon year, without ever ceasing, and the boy grew up within that holy place, dear listener, breathing that fragrant smoke, hearing always that music, the strange and lovely music of the East, the high sweet pipes, and the ringing cymbals, and the deep soft drums, learning from the time he could walk the sacred words and the sacred gestures, taught to honour his God with his whole body and his whole soul, taught above all to dance before the altar in the slow and beautiful ritual dances of his people, turning and swaying in his shimmering robes of silk and gold, while the music played, and the incense rose, and the fires burned low and golden. A small and solemn and beautiful figure, utterly given over to his God. And there were the great festivals, dear listener, the high holy days of the sun, when the whole city of the temple would gather, and the boy priest would lead the worship before all the people, and the God would be brought out in procession in the warm bright air, and there would be music and dancing and offerings and feasting, and the whole community would pour out its devotion together beneath the burning sun that was the very face of their God. And to the boy all of this was not strange at all, and not foreign, and not excessive. It was simply the world. It was the centre of all things, the warm, bright, beating heart of everything he knew. He had never known any other life, never imagined any other, never dreamed that the whole wide world did not turn, as his did, around the worship of the great sun and its holy fallen stone. It was his home, and his family, and his faith, and his very self, all woven together into one seamless whole, so that there was, in truth, no part of the boy that was separate from the priest, and no part of the priest that was separate from the God. He could no more have ceased to be a servant of the sun, dear listener, than he could have ceased to breathe. And so, when fate reached down and snatched him up out of that warm golden temple, and carried him away across the sea to the cold great city of Rome, to be the master of an empire he had never seen, he carried all of this inside him, unchanged and unchangeable, the incense and the music and the dancing and the holy black stone and the burning sun, and he could only ever be, upon that distant alien throne, exactly what he had always been from the very beginning, a priest of his God, a child of the sun, a stranger in a land that would never, ever understand him. But the boy had a grandmother, dear listener, and she was a woman of enormous will and enormous ambition, and she had once stood near the very centre of the world's power, and she had been cast down from it, and she wanted it back, for her family had ruled Rome, and then, through treachery and misfortune, the throne had slipped away into other hands, into the hands of a man who had seized it by arranging a murder, and this shrewd and formidable old woman could not bear it, and she set herself, with all the patience and all the cunning of her remarkable mind, to win it back for her family. And when she looked about her for the means to do it, her eyes fell upon her grandson, the priest boy, dancing in his golden robes before the altar of his sun god. And she saw in that beautiful exotic child a key that might unlock the throne. For the soldiers of the great legion stationed nearby had loved a certain dead warrior emperor, the haunted brother of our last tale, loved him because he had lived as one of them and been generous to them, and they had never been content with the man who had taken his place by treachery. And so the shrewd old grandmother and the boy's mother began, quietly, to spread a claim, a whisper that grew into a rumour, that grew into a banner, that this boy, this priest of the sun, was in secret truth the very son of that beloved dead emperor, his hidden child, his rightful heir. And they showed the boy to the soldiers. They brought him before them in all his strange and shining priestly splendour, and they reminded the soldiers of the emperor they had loved and lost, and they spread their gold among them with an open hand, and the soldiers, dear listener, half believing and half bought, and wholly weary of the man who then ruled them, took up the boy's cause and proclaimed him emperor. And there was a battle, and the man who had taken the throne by treachery was defeated and fell. And so it came to pass that a boy of perhaps 14 years, a hereditary priest of a foreign sun god, who had never in his life governed anything more than a temple rite, became, in a single astonishing turn, the master of the entire Roman world. And the boy came to Rome, dear listener. But he did not come alone, and he did not come empty-handed. He brought his God with him. He brought the great black sacred stone, the holy stone of the sun, carried in a magnificent jewelled chariot drawn by horses, the boy himself walking backward before it the whole way, so as never to turn his face from his God. And he came to the great city with one fixed and burning purpose above all others, a purpose that mattered to him far more than the dull business of ruling an empire, and that purpose was to make his God, his sun god of the black stone, the supreme god of Rome. Not merely one god among the many that the city already honoured, but the highest of all, set above every other, above even the greatest and most ancient of the old Roman gods, the king of the gods himself. And to that end the boy poured out the wealth of the world. He built for his God a great and splendid temple upon one of the sacred hills of the city, and there he installed the holy black stone in magnificence, and there, dressed in his flowing eastern robes of silk and purple and gold, his face painted in the manner of his homeland, the boy emperor conducted the rites of his God as he had been raised to do since infancy. The grand processions through the streets, the music of strange instruments, the dancing, the boy himself dancing before the altar of his God as he had danced as a small child in the distant temple, the lavish sacrifices, the whole rich and beautiful and utterly foreign worship of the eastern sun. And to the boy, dear listener, all of this was the most natural and the most holy thing in all the world. It was simply his life, his faith, the worship he had known and loved since before he could remember. He was doing nothing more, in his own mind, than bringing the true and the greatest God to the greatest city, an act of the deepest piety and devotion. But to the Romans who watched, dear listener, it was something else entirely. To the proud and traditional people of that old city, who had honoured their own gods in their own grave and ancient ways for 1,000 years, the spectacle of their own emperor, dressed in foreign silks and painted like a stranger, dancing before a black stone from the east and demanding that they cast down their own gods and set his above them, was bewildering and shocking and offensive to the very depths of their souls. It was an outrage against everything that made Rome Rome. They watched their boy emperor in his glittering foreign robes, and they did not see a holy priest serving the greatest of gods. They saw a strange foreign child making a mockery of all that they held sacred, and their unease curdled slowly into anger. And the boy, dear listener, in his sincere and total devotion, went further still, in ways that wounded the old city more deeply yet. For it was not enough, to his mind, merely to bring his God to Rome and to build him a temple. He wished to make his sun god truly the supreme lord of all, to gather the whole sacred life of the city up and lay it at the feet of his God. And so he set about, with all the earnest zeal of a devoted priest, to bring the most holy things of Rome itself into the keeping of his son. He had the ancient and sacred objects that the Romans held most precious, the holy relics that had been guarded with reverence for centuries as the very luck and soul of the city, gathered up and brought to the temple of his God, so that all the sacred power of Rome might be united under the sun. And he conceived the idea of a great marriage, a divine wedding, in which his sun god would be wed in splendid ceremony to one of the great goddesses of the Roman world, so that the gods of the East and the gods of Rome might be joined together as one holy family beneath his God's supremacy. And he celebrated this divine marriage of his God with an enormous public festival, the like of which the city had rarely seen, a vast outpouring of celebration and largesse, with gifts scattered among the people, and feasting and games, and the streets decked in splendour, all in honour of the wedding of his son. And once each year, dear listener, at the height of the summer, when the sun stood at its most powerful in the sky, the boy held the greatest festival of all, the high holy festival of his God. And on that day the holy black stone was taken up from its temple and placed in a magnificent chariot, all of gold and jewels, drawn by a team of great white horses, and the stone was carried in solemn and dazzling procession through the streets of the city, from the temple on the hill out to a great shrine in the gardens beyond the walls. And the boy emperor himself, dear listener, walked the whole long way before the chariot of his god, walking backward, his face turned always toward the holy stone, so that he might never once turn his back upon it, holding the reins of the horses, guiding them as he stepped slowly backward over the strewn streets, while the whole city looked on. And the way was made soft and golden before the god, and there was music, and there were dances, and from high places great quantities of gifts were thrown down among the watching crowds, money and fine cloths, and all manner of precious things, so that the people scrambled and reached for the falling treasures, while the holy stone passed by in its blazing chariot, and the painted boy stepped backward before it in his shining robes. And to the boy, dear listener, it was the most glorious and the most sacred day of all the year, the day when his beloved God was honoured before the whole world as the great Lord of heaven. But the grave old Romans watched their emperor walking backward through the streets before a black stone in a golden chariot, and many of them turned their faces away and shook their heads and went home troubled, feeling that the world had somehow been turned upside down, that something deep and ancient and right had been overthrown, and that no good could come of it in the end. For the boy was a child, dear listener, and he ruled as a child rules, which is to say that he did not really rule at all. He had no understanding of the vast and complicated machinery of the empire, and no interest in learning it, and no patience for the long dull hours of laws and disputes and reports that the true work of ruling required. The real power, then, lay not with the boy at all, but with the formidable women who had raised him up, his shrewd grandmother and his mother, who managed the affairs of state from behind the throne. And his mother indeed took for herself a place among the high council of the city, sitting in their deliberations, a thing that had never in all the long history of Rome been permitted to a woman, and that scandalized the old families nearly as much as the foreign god. And it was a strange thing to behold, dear listener, and unlike anything the old city had ever known, this court ruled by women and by a child. For the true masters of the Roman world in those years were not generals, and were not senators, and were not the boy upon the throne at all, but two formidable women of the East, the shrewd old grandmother and the boy's mother, who together held the real reins of power in their hands, and governed the empire from behind the painted boy and his blazing god. The old grandmother, who had schemed so patiently to win the throne for her family, was perhaps the cleverest and most capable of them all, and it was she, more than any other, who kept the great machine of the state turning, while her grandson danced before his stone. And the mother sat among the high councillors of the city, as though she were one of them, her voice heard in their gravest deliberations, and orders went out across the world in the boy's name that were truly the will of these two women. And there is something almost admirable in it, dear listener, the skill and the strength of these remarkable women holding the whole vast empire steady through such strange days. But to the proud old men of Rome, who had never in 1,000 years suffered a woman to share in the rule of the state, it was one more sign that the world had been turned upside down, one more strangeness piled upon all the others, the foreign boy and the foreign god and the black stone and the dancing, and now women seated in the councils of power, until it seemed to them that nothing of the old and proper order of things remained standing at all, and that some great correction must surely before long come. And the boy himself, freed of every restraint, with the wealth of the world in his hands, and no one to tell him no, gave himself, as children with too much will so often do, to his God and to his pleasures, and to the most lavish and fantastical whims that a boundless imagination and a bottomless treasury could devise. And here, dear listener, we come to the famous tales, the wild and glittering stories of his extravagance that have come down through the ages, and we must hold them gently and lightly for two reasons. The first is that many of them are surely exaggerations, tall tales and slanders heaped up by those who hated him after he was gone, piled upon the memory of a foreign boy whom no one was left to defend, until the legend grew far larger and far stranger than the truth could ever have been. And the second is that even those that hold some grain of truth speak, in the end, not of a monster, but only of a child given the impossible gift of unlimited wealth and unlimited freedom, and not the faintest idea of any reason to restrain himself. For the tales tell of banquets of impossible splendour, of tables heaped with the rarest and most costly delicacies gathered from the farthest ends of the earth, of dishes served upon gold and eaten with jewelled spoons. They tell of his love of luxury and colour and perfume, of rooms strewn with roses and filled with sweet scents, of silks and gems and every soft and beautiful thing. There is a famous tale, dear listener, that at one of his great feasts he had so vast a quantity of flower petals released from above upon his guests, a soft and endless rain of petals drifting down, that some of the revellers, it is said, were quite buried beneath the gentle fragrant fall of them. Whether that is true, or only a lovely strange story, who now can say? But you can see in it, can you not, dear listener, not so much cruelty as a kind of dreaming childish excess, a boy who had been handed the whole world as a toy, and who played with it, lavishly, wonderingly, without the smallest sense that there was any reason on earth why he should not. For the tales of his whims and his wonders, dear listener, go on and on, each stranger and more lavish than the last. They tell of feasts where every dish, course after course, was made all of a single colour, a whole banquet of gold, or a whole banquet of green, or of blue, the food and the cloths and the cups all matched to one shade. They tell of foods gathered from the very ends of the known world at unimaginable cost, of the rarest birds and the rarest fish brought from distant seas, of delicacies so precious that a single meal might cost more than a working family would see in a lifetime. They tell of his love of sweet scents, of halls and chambers filled with the costliest perfumes of the East, of fountains, it is said, that flowed not with plain water but with wine, or with waters made fragrant with rare oils and spices. They tell of his delight in surprise and spectacle and novelty, of strange and wonderful animals harnessed to draw his chariots, of marvels and tricks and entertainments devised to astonish his guests, of a boy for ever reaching for the next wonder, the next delight, the next beautiful and impossible thing that the wealth of the whole world could be made to provide. And in all of it, dear listener, there is the same quality, the quality not of a cold and calculating tyrant scheming cruelties in the dark, but of a child, a dreaming, wondering, endlessly indulged child who had been handed the treasury of an empire as another child might be handed a box of toys, and who simply played, delightedly, extravagantly, never once stopping to ask whether he ought, because no one in all his strange short life had ever taught him a single reason why he should ever deny himself anything at all. And yet, dear listener, we must say it again, and say it clearly, here in the gentle dark, for it matters. How much of all this is even true, we cannot know. We cannot know at all. For these tales were written down, almost all of them, by people who hated him, or who came long after, and gathered up every rumour and every slander that had ever attached to his name, and the wildest and most shocking of the tales are very often the ones we have the least reason to believe. He was a foreigner, and a boy, and a follower of a strange god, and when he fell there was no one left who loved him to speak in his defence. And so the stories grew and grew, heaping excess upon excess and strangeness upon strangeness, until the figure that came down to us through the long centuries was less a real and living boy than a kind of monster made of rumour, a thing assembled out of other people's scorn. And the real child, dear listener, the actual boy who lived and breathed and loved his God, and was frightened and was used, that boy is half lost to us now behind the glittering lurid legend, and we must reach for him carefully and gently, through all the smoke of all those hostile tales, and remember that whatever the truth of him was, it was almost certainly smaller and sadder and far more human than the strange bright monster that the centuries chose to remember in his place. But the Romans, dear listener, did not find it charming, and above all the soldiers who had made him grew weary and ashamed of him. For these were hard and practical men who had proclaimed him emperor, believing him the son of a soldier they had loved, expecting another soldier, another hard-marching general in the old mould. And what they had got instead was a strange painted foreign boy who danced before a black stone and showered his friends with flower petals, and cared nothing for the army or the wars or the grim business of the empire. And slowly, dear listener, the same soldiers who had raised him up upon their shields began to turn their faces away from him in disgust, and the love that had made him began to cool and to sour, exactly as it had soured before for others we have met, into something cold and dangerous and waiting. And the shrewd old grandmother, dear listener, who missed nothing, saw the danger gathering, and being above all things a woman who wished her family to keep its hold upon power, she began to look beyond the boy emperor to a way of saving the family, even if the boy himself should fall. For there was another grandson, a younger cousin of the boy emperor, a quieter and gentler and more sensible child, who seemed far more Roman in his ways, far more like the kind of ruler the soldiers and the city longed for. And the old grandmother arranged with all her cunning for the boy emperor to adopt this young cousin as his son and his heir and his successor, so that the line might continue in safer hands. But this, dear listener, proved the beginning of the end, for the boy emperor, who was after all only a jealous child, came to resent his cousin bitterly, for the soldiers and the people plainly came to prefer the quiet, sensible boy to the strange foreign one. And the boy emperor, stung and frightened and jealous, turned against his cousin, and sought to push him aside, and even, the stories say, to do him harm. And this was the fatal mistake, dear listener, the one that could not be forgiven. For the soldiers had come to love the gentle cousin, and to see in him their hope, and when they understood that the strange boy emperor meant to move against the very child they had set their hopes upon, their long cooling loyalty broke at last entirely, and turned to open fury. And the end, when it came, dear listener, was swift, and it was cruel, as such ends so often were. The soldiers rose against him. They had had enough of the foreign god, and the painted robes, and the flower petals, and the jealous childish spite, and they turned upon the boy emperor, and upon his mother, who had ruled through him, and stood always at his side. And in the chaos and the violence of that day, the two of them, the mother and the boy, were killed together, side by side, the mother and her son, and their bodies were treated with great contempt by the angry soldiers, and dragged through the streets of the city, and cast at last into the river that ran through it, and carried away into the dark. And so he was gone, dear listener, the boy priest of the sun, the dancer before the black stone, the strange foreign child who had been emperor of Rome. He was about 18 years old. He had been, from the first day to the last, a boy. And the moment he was gone, dear listener, the whole strange dream of him was swept away, as though it had never been. His gentle cousin took the throne, and ruled in the old grave Roman manner that the city longed for. And the foreign god of the sun was cast down from the high place where the boy had set him, and the great black sacred stone, the holy stone that the boy had loved and served since infancy, the piece of heaven he had carried backward all the way to Rome, was taken up and sent away, back to the distant eastern land it had come from, back to its old home and its old temple, and the ancient gods of Rome were restored to their places. And it was as though the brief, strange, glittering interlude of the boy and his sun-god had been only a dream, dreamed by the city on a single feverish night, and now forgotten with the dawn. So what, dear listener, are we to make of him, here at the last, in the deep and gentle dark? The legend gives us a byword for decadence, a strange and scandalous figure draped in excess, and the lurid old tales would have us shudder at him. But of all the rulers we have met tonight, he is perhaps the one who deserves least of all our judgment, and most of all our pity, for he was a child. He never chose any of it. He was a boy raised in a distant temple to serve a god he loved, and he was snatched up out of that life by powerful and ambitious people, by a grandmother who wanted a throne and an army that wanted gold, and he was used, dear listener, used as a tool, a key, a banner, set upon the most dangerous seat in all the world while he was still half a child, with no preparation, no understanding, and no one to truly guide or protect him save the very women who were using him for their own ends. And he did, upon that throne, the only thing he had ever truly known how to do, which was to serve his God, to bring the worship he loved to the great city, in all sincerity, in all devotion, never understanding that the city would hate him for it, that he belonged, body and soul and faith, to a world that Rome could never accept, and that for that crime, the crime of being a stranger and a child, and out of his depth, he would be destroyed before he ever had the chance to grow into a man. Power, dear listener, did not so much reveal some hidden darkness in him as it simply exposed a child to a role that no child could ever have survived, and left him to be torn apart by it. He was not perhaps a monster at all. He was only a boy who never had a chance. So let him rest now too, dear listener, this last of our restless rulers, 2,000 years gone, the boy priest of the sun laid down at last, out of the long reach of all the lurid tales, his foreign god sent gently home, his black stone returned to the warm eastern land it fell to from the sky, his glittering robes and his flower petals and his sacred dances all faded now into the silence of the centuries. Let the whole strange and sorrowful and beautiful world of him sink softly down and away into the dark, the temple and the black stone and the painted boy dancing before his god in a city that would not understand him, all of it quiet now, all of it still, all of it long, long over. And let your own breathing slow once more, dear listener, and let your own shoulders fall, and let the warmth gather close and kind around you here, in the safe and ordinary dark, 2,000 years and a whole world away from all of it, and let yourself drift gently and without any fear at all, down and down and down towards sleep. And so we come, dear listener, to the last of our tales, the final story of this long and quiet night. And it is fitting, perhaps, that we should end with a man who shows us, more clearly than almost any of the others, a truth that has run quietly beneath everything we have spoken of in the dark. For this last ruler was in the cold judgment of history a tyrant and a monster, hated and feared, and there is truth in that, as there has been truth in all the dark things we have said tonight. But he was also, underneath the legend, a far more capable and a far more complicated man than the monster tale allows. And his story is, at its very heart, the story of something we have seen again and again as the night has worn on, the story of a wound carried in from childhood that all the power in the world could never heal, and of a fear that no throne, however high, could ever still. So settle in one last time, dear listener. Let the warmth gather close. Let your breathing slow, and let the last cares of your day drift away into the dark, and come with me to meet a man who ruled the whole world, and was afraid every single day of it. For his tale, dear listener, like so many of the saddest tales, begins in a shadow, the shadow cast by those who are loved more than we are. He was a younger son, born into a family that was rising, in his own lifetime, to the very summit of the world. His father was a practical, plain-spoken, capable old soldier, a man of common origins who had risen through a long career of solid service, and who came at last, in a time of terrible chaos and civil war, after the fall of an emperor and the bloody scramble that followed, to seize the throne and to restore order to a shaken empire, and to found a new ruling line. And the old soldier emperor ruled well, dear listener, with shrewdness and good humour and a careful hand, mending the broken finances of the state, calming the exhausted world, beginning great works of building to give the people back their pride. He was, by the measure of rulers, a good one. But he had 2 sons, and it was the elder of the 2 upon whom the light of glory and of love so warmly fell. For the elder brother, dear listener, was everything that draws the love of a people. He was handsome and charming and brave, a brilliant young general who had won great victories and great fame in the wars of the East, the conqueror of a famous and ancient city after a long and terrible siege. He was generous and gracious and warm, and the people adored him, called him their delight, their darling, the love of all the human race. And when their father died, full of years and honour, it was this beloved elder brother who took the throne. And though he ruled for only a short time, a mere 2 years or so, he ruled in a blaze of goodwill, meeting the great disasters that fell in his brief reign. A terrible eruption of a burning mountain that buried whole cities, a great fire, a plague, meeting all of it with such open-handed generosity and such genuine care for his suffering people that he was loved all the more for it, and is remembered to this day as one of the most beloved of all who ever wore the purple. And all the while, dear listener, in the bright shadow of that glorious father and that beloved brother, there stood the younger son, watching. For to him had come none of it, none of the glory, none of the great commands, none of the famous victories, none of the warm and easy love of the people that fell so freely upon his brother. While his father and his brother had won their fame in the wars and the great affairs of the world, the younger son had been kept at home, kept young, kept in his place, given little real power and little real trust, allowed to stand near the throne but never upon it, near the glory but never within it. And it galled him, dear listener, it festered in him, to be the son of one emperor and the brother of another, and yet to be passed over, overlooked, set always in the second place, always in the shadow, always watching the love and the honour flow past him toward someone else. We cannot know all that grew in his heart in those long overshadowed years, but we can guess at it, can we not? The slow accumulation of slight upon slight, the jealousy, the resentment, the bitter private hunger of a man who feels himself as worthy as those who are praised, and who is never ever praised himself. And that hunger, dear listener, that old unhealed wound of being unloved and unhonoured, would shape everything that came after, when at last the shadow lifted, and the power he had been denied so long fell, suddenly, into his waiting hands. For consider, dear listener, gently, what those long overshadowed years must have been, day after day, for the younger son. To grow up in a house where greatness was the very air, where one's father was the master of the world, and one's brother the darling of it, and to find that one's own place in that bright house was always at the edge of the light, never within it, to attend the triumphs and the celebrations, and to stand a little apart, and to watch the crowds pour out their love upon his brother, the cheering, the flowers, the shining adoration, and to feel it pass him by, again as it always passed him by, as though he were not quite there at all, to be given small honours and empty titles, the appearance of importance without its substance, a seat near the throne but no voice from it, so that he was for ever close enough to the power to taste it, and never close enough to hold it, to know himself in his own private heart, to be capable, to be worthy, to be made of the same blood and the same stuff as the brother who was loved, and to be passed over all the same, every time, in favour of that brother, while no one seemed even to notice that he was being passed over, while it seemed simply the natural order of things that the light should fall on the one and the shadow on the other. There is a particular loneliness in that, dear listener, a particular slow corrosion of the soul, the loneliness not of the one who is hated, for hatred at least is a kind of attention, but of the one who is simply overlooked, set aside, taken for granted, loved less and honoured less and seen less, year upon year, until he half disappears even to himself, And a child who grows up in that long shadow, dear listener, learns a bitter lesson down in the marrow of him, that love is something given to others, that honour is something he must seize because it will never be freely offered, that he is, in the secret reckoning of the world, not enough, and never has been, and that the only answer to that unbearable smallness is to climb, and climb, and climb, until he stands so high that no one can ever overlook him again. And so the younger son waited in the shadow, and the bitterness deepened in him quietly, and the hunger grew, and he watched, and he bided his time, until the day the shadow lifted at last, and the great prize fell into his hands, the prize that he believed, surely, with all his wounded heart, would finally make it all right, would finally make him great, would finally make him seen, and loved, and enough. It would not, dear listener. It never does, but he could not have known that yet, on the day the world at last was his. For the beloved elder brother died, young, after only those 2 brief shining years, and there were dark whispers afterward, as there always were, about whether the younger had hastened that death to seize the throne at last, though the truth of it no one can now say. But however it came, the throne was his at last, the throne he had stood beside and been denied for so long, and the overlooked younger son became, in his turn, the master of the entire Roman world. And here, dear listener, comes the first surprise of his tale, the part the monster legend so often forgets. For he ruled, in a great many ways, and through a great many years, remarkably well. He was no idle pleasure-seeker, no dreaming artist, no foreign child lost upon the throne. He was a hard and tireless and exacting administrator who took the actual labour of ruling seriously and did it with real skill. He tended the finances of the empire with great care and kept the coinage sound and strong. He looked to the defence of the vast frontiers, leading campaigns himself against the tribes beyond the borders, strengthening the great chains of forts and walls that guarded the Roman world. He built and built magnificently, completing the enormous arena that his father and brother had begun, that mighty ring of stone whose ruins still stand at the heart of the city today, and raising for himself upon one of the sacred hills a vast and splendid palace, and rebuilding great swaths of the city that fire had destroyed. He concerned himself with the morals and the order of the state, and with justice in the provinces, where his governors knew he watched them closely and would not tolerate corruption, and he was generous to the common people, with games and gifts and grain, and careful of the soldiers, who were paid well and led ably, so that the ordinary people of the empire and the men of the legions came, many of them, to value him as a strong and competent and even a good master. He was, dear listener, by the plain measure of how an empire is run, one of the more able men ever to hold the throne, far abler than many who are remembered far more kindly. But the wound, dear listener, the wound was always there beneath all of it. The old hunger to be honoured, the old fear of being slighted, the old need to be recognized at last as the equal, no, as the superior, of those who had been loved more than he. And no amount of competent ruling, no amount of building or defending or administering could ever fill that hollow place, or still that old anxious need. And so he reached, as the wounded and the hollow so often reach, for something more, something that would lift him, once and for all, above every slight and every rivalry and every comparison, that would make it impossible for anyone ever again to look past him or above him. He reached to be called a god, for he began, dear listener, to insist that he be addressed, in speech and in writing, by a title that no living emperor before him had ever systematically demanded, the title of Lord and God. Not merely emperor, not merely first among men, but Lord and God, divine, to be honoured as a deity while he yet walked the earth and breathed the air, his very letters and official documents to begin with that claim of his godhood. Think of it, dear listener. Think of what it means that a man should need so badly to be called a god. It is not the act of a man who feels himself great. It is the act of a man who feels himself small, so unhonoured down in the depths of him, that nothing less than godhood, demanded and enforced, could ever quiet the old aching voice within that whispered that he was not enough, had never been enough, would never be enough, the overlooked younger son still, even upon the throne of the world. And it was a strange and a heavy thing, dear listener, for a whole great society to be made to treat a living man as a god. For it was not enough that the title be his in private or in name alone. It went out into the world and reshaped it. His likeness in gold and silver was set up everywhere, in the temples and the squares and the halls of justice, gazing down, and before those images the proper honours of a god were to be paid. The very words of worship were folded into the daily business of the empire, so that to write to him, to petition him, to speak of him in any formal way, one had to name him Lord and God, had to bow the knee of the language itself before his divinity, whether one believed a word of it or not. And so the whole vast machinery of the Roman world was made to bend day by day in the small constant gestures of a worship that most of those who performed it surely did not feel, the courtiers and the officials and the petitioners all murmuring the sacred words, all making the expected obeisance, all calling the frightened man upon the throne a god to his face. And there is something deeply hollow in it, dear listener, something almost unbearably empty, when you think upon it in the quiet dark. For a god who must compel his own worship, who must write his divinity into the law and enforce it with fear, who must demand the bent knee rather than receive it freely given, is no god at all, and knows it, somewhere beneath the title and the gold, knows that every bow is given to his power and not to his person, that the moment the power failed, the worship would vanish like morning mist, that he was loved by no one, and feared by all, and worshipped by all, and believed in by none. And he must have known it, dear listener, in the long nights, the overlooked younger son beneath the god's gold mask, must have heard, beneath all the murmured sacred words, the old silence where love should have been, the silence that had been there since his childhood in the shadow of his brother, and that all the forced worship of all the world could never ever fill. And the more keenly he sensed that hollowness, dear listener, the more fiercely he clung to the demand, and the more savagely he turned upon any hint that the worship was not sincere, until at last the having of the title was no comfort to him at all, but only one more thing to be defended, one more height from which he might be cast down, one more proof, written across the whole empire in gold and law, of exactly how far there was for him to fall. And as the years of his reign wore on, dear listener, the old wound did not heal, as we might hope a wound would heal, with time and power and success. It darkened, it deepened, it spread. For the more absolute his power grew, the more he feared to lose it, and the more he insisted upon his godhood, the more keenly he sensed the silent contempt of those who would not truly believe in it. Above all the proud old senators, the great families of the city, who he knew despised him in their hearts, who remembered his common origins and his overshadowed youth, who bowed to him and called him Lord and God to his face and mocked him, he was certain, behind his back. And the certainty of their hidden hatred fed his fear, and his fear fed his cruelty, and slowly the able and hard-working ruler curdled into something darker, a suspicious and frightened tyrant who saw plots gathering in every shadow and conspiracies whispering behind every closed door, and who turned upon the men he feared with treason trials and accusations and executions, until a heavy and choking atmosphere of dread settled over the whole upper world of the city, and no great man could feel safe, and every careless word might be reported, and every friend might be a spy, and the smallest sign of insufficient devotion to the living God upon the throne might be enough to mark a man for death. And so a particular kind of silence settled over the great city in those years, dear listener, a watchful, fearful, listening silence that lay over all the high places and the great houses like a fog that would not lift. For when a ruler has taught the powerful to fear him, the whole texture of life among them changes, quietly, completely. Men learnt to guard their words, every word, at every table, in every gathering, for one never knew who might be listening, who might carry a careless phrase to the wrong ear, who among one's own friends and guests and servants might be an informer, hoping to win favour, or to save his own skin by giving up another. They learnt to school their faces, to keep them smooth and pleasant and untroubled no matter what they felt. For a frown at the wrong moment, a look held a heartbeat too long, might be noticed and remembered and reported. They learnt to praise where praise was expected, loudly and often, and to bow low, and to call the man a god with every appearance of sincerity, while keeping their true thoughts locked away in the one place that could not yet be searched, the silence of their own hearts. And the great houses, dear listener, that had once rung with open talk and easy laughter, grew careful and quiet and wary, the conversation turning always to safe and empty things, the weather and the games and the price of grain, while underneath, unspoken, ran the constant cold current of fear. For everyone knew of the trials, and the accusations, and the men who had risen in the morning as great lords, and by evening were gone, their names suddenly dangerous to speak, their friends suddenly anxious to be thought never to have known them well. And no one, dear listener, no matter how high, no matter how loyal, no matter how careful, could feel entirely safe, for the danger did not follow clear rules that a prudent man might keep to. It came as the fear in one frightened mind decreed, and that fear was not reasonable, and could not be reasoned with, and so the only safety was in smallness, in silence, in giving no sign, and no handle, and no cause, in becoming, as far as one could, invisible. It was an exhausting way to live, dear listener, a slow and grinding and sleepless way, the whole upper world of the city holding its breath together, year after year, smiling its careful frightened smiles, waiting in the quiet for a knock upon the door that might come for anyone at any hour, and that everyone, in the secret of the night, lay awake and dreaded. And there is a tale told of him, dear listener, that captures better than any other the strange cold cruelty that grew in him in those dark years, and the terror that he learnt to wield not with the sword alone, but with the mind. For it is said that he once invited the leading men of the city, the great senators and nobles, to a grand banquet at the palace, and when they arrived, dear listener, they found themselves led into a hall that had been made entirely black. The walls were black, the ceiling was black, the couches upon which they were to recline were black, and the floor beneath them was black, and the hall was lit only dimly by a few faint lights, so that all was shadow and gloom. And beside each guest, the tale goes, there was set a slab of stone shaped like a tombstone, a grave marker, and upon each one was carved the name of the guest who sat beside it, his own name as upon a tomb. And the food was brought in upon black dishes, the kind of offerings that were made to the spirits of the dead, and it was served by attendants, the story says, who were themselves painted black, moving silently through the gloom like shades, like ghosts, like the spirits of the underworld. And the emperor reclined among his terrified guests, and spoke, all through that long black evening, of nothing but death, and dying, and the dead. And the great men of the city sat there in the blackness, beside the tombstones bearing their own names, certain in their bones, every one of them, that they had been brought there to die, that this was their last night, that at any moment the blow would fall, frozen in a terror so complete that they could scarcely breathe, scarcely move, scarcely keep the trembling from their hands. And then, dear listener, when the long dreadful evening was over, the emperor sent them home, unharmed, alive, back to their houses, through the dark streets, shaking, hardly believing they still lived. And later the tale says, to each of them he sent gifts, fine and costly gifts, including the very tombstone of silver that had borne his name, as if to say, "I gave you your life back. Remember it. Remember who holds it. Remember that I can take it whenever I choose." There was no blood spilled that night, dear listener, not a drop. And yet it was perhaps the cruelest thing he ever did, this slow, patient feast of pure terror, this teaching of the most powerful men in the world that their very lives were nothing but a toy in the hand of the frightened god upon the throne. And his own fear, dear listener, grew with every passing year, until it ruled him as surely as he ruled the world. For a man who has taught everyone around him to fear him, has also taught himself that everyone around him has reason to wish him dead. And so the tyrant who spreads terror comes, in the end, to live in terror himself, trapped in the very dread he has created. And it is said that in his later years he became so consumed by the fear of the assassin's blade, that he could not bear to walk anywhere without watching his own back, and that he had the walls of the colonnades where he took his exercise lined with a smooth and shining stone, polished until it gleamed like a mirror, so that as he walked he might see reflected in those bright surfaces everything that happened behind him, every approach, every movement, so that no one could ever come upon him unseen. Imagine that, dear listener. Imagine a man who rules the entire world, and who cannot take a quiet walk in his own palace without watching the mirrored walls for the shadow of the killer he is certain is coming. And it is said too that in his private hours he grew strange and solitary, and would shut himself away alone, occupying himself with the catching of flies, piercing them one by one with the point of a sharp pen, so that it became a grim jest in the city that when someone asked whether anyone was with the emperor, the answer came, "Not even a fly." A man alone, dear listener, in his great and splendid palace, the master of the world, the living God, sitting in an empty room, watching the mirrored walls, killing flies, and waiting, always waiting, for the blow he was sure would someday come. And the terrible thing, dear listener, the thing that is almost a kind of dark justice, and almost a kind of deep sadness, is that his fear in the end made itself come true. For as his suspicion deepened, he began to turn upon even those closest to him, the very people of his own household and his own court, the officials and the servants and the guards who lived nearest to him and knew him best, until at last those people came to understand that no nearness, no loyalty, no service could protect them, that the frightened god might turn upon any one of them at any moment, that their own names perhaps already stood upon some secret list of the doomed. And so, cornered and desperate, and with nothing left to lose, the people of his own household resolved to strike before they could be struck. And it is said that even his own wife was drawn into the plot, fearing for her own life. And in the end, dear listener, it was done not by armies in the field, nor by senators in the chamber, but by the hands of those who served him most closely, in his own private rooms, in his own bedchamber, where one who attended him concealed a blade and fell upon him, and others rushed in, and there was a desperate and terrible struggle, for he fought hard for his life to the very last, the frightened god clinging to the existence he had spent so long defending, but it was no use. And there, in the heart of his own palace, surrounded by the splendour he had built, the overlooked younger son who had become the living god came at last to his end. He was 44 years old, and here, dear listener, at the very last, comes the final twist of his strange tale, the thing that tells us most of all about how the dead are judged, and by whom. For when the news of his death spread through the city, the great senators, the proud men he had terrorized and humiliated and made to sit beside their own tombstones in the dark, rejoiced openly and without shame, and they fell upon his memory with a fury, voting that his name be scratched from every inscription, and his images thrown down, and his statues dragged from their pedestals and melted into nothing, that he be unmade and erased and remembered only with curses. But the common people of the city, dear listener, who had known him as a giver of games and grain, were largely indifferent, neither grieving nor rejoicing, and the soldiers of the legions, who had known him as a strong paymaster and an able commander, were not indifferent at all. They were angry. They grieved him. They demanded that his killers be found and punished. And so you see, dear listener, the verdict of monster that has come down to us across the centuries was, above all, the verdict of one particular group of people, the senators, the great writers and historians, the very class he had most feared and most cruelly used, the people who survived him and who held the pen. To the soldiers he was a good general, to the people he was an able ruler, to the senators he was a nightmare, and it was the senators who wrote the histories, and so it is as a nightmare that the long centuries have remembered him. And the truth, dear listener, as the truth so often is, lies somewhere tangled in between, in the strange and divided figure of a man who governed an empire with real skill and real care, and who at the same time spread terror and demanded godhood, and walked his mirrored halls in fear. An able tyrant, a competent monster, a capable and frightened and deeply wounded man. So what, then, are we to make of him, dear listener, here at the very end of our long night, the last of all the strange and sorrowful rulers we have met in the dark? The legend gives us a tyrant who called himself a god, and feasted his enemies in halls of black, and killed flies alone in empty rooms, and there is truth in it. But underneath the legend, if we are gentle, as we have tried to be gentle all night long, we find the oldest and the saddest story of all. We find a younger son who stood his whole young life in the shadow of those who were loved more than he was, who watched the glory and the honour and the warmth flow always past him toward his father and his brother, who was overlooked and passed over and made to feel small, year after year after year, until that smallness hardened into a wound that no later greatness could ever heal. And we find that when the power he had been denied so long came at last into his hands, it did not fill the hollow place, and it did not quiet the old aching voice, and it did not make him feel, even for a moment, that he was finally enough. It only gave him a god's title to demand, and a world to be afraid of, and mirrored walls to watch, and the whole long terrible freedom to spread to everyone around him the very fear that lived inside him. For power, dear listener, as we have seen now through this whole long night, in life after life after life, does not heal the wounds we carry, and it does not fill the empty places, and it does not silence the old voices that tell us we are small. It only takes whatever was already there inside us, the fear, the hunger, the hollowness, the grief, and it makes it vast, and gives it a whole world to play upon, and lets it grow without any limit at all. And so the overlooked younger son ruled the world, and demanded to be called a god, and was afraid every single day, until the day the fear came true. So let him rest now too, dear listener, this last of our rulers, 2,000 years gone, the frightened god laid down at last, his mirrored colonnades fallen, his black banquet only a story drifting down the ages, his name scratched away by the very men he terrified, and then, in time, half remembered after all, the able hand and the wounded heart both still now and quiet beneath the long centuries. Let the whole strange divided world of him sink softly down and away into the dark, the great arena and the splendid palace, the tombstones in the gloom and the empty room and the flies and the watching walls, all of it quiet now, all of it still, all of it long, long over. And let them all rest now, dear listener, every one of them, all the strange and sorrowful souls we have walked beside through this long and quiet night. The frightened child in the little boots, and the hollow artist who longed only to be loved, and the lost son who threw away the golden world he was given, and the haunted brother who could never stop running, and the boy priest of the sun who never had a chance, and this last frightened god in his mirrored halls. So different, all of them, across so many long years, and yet so alike in the end, every one of them undone not by the wide world outside, but by something small and old and unhealed, carried quietly within. Every one of them given the whole earth, and finding that it was not enough to fill the empty place inside a single human heart. Let them all rest now, the whole long sad procession of them, their palaces fallen, their statues toppled, their fears and their hungers and their griefs all stilled at last, 2,000 years and a whole world away, all of it quiet, all of it gentle now, all of it finally and for ever at peace. And let your own breathing slow, dear listener, one last time, and let your shoulders fall, and let the warmth gather close and kind around you here in the safe and ordinary dark, far from all the marble, and all the fear, and all the long-dead glory, and let yourself drift, gently and without any fear at all, down and down and down, into a deep and peaceful and untroubled sleep.